listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition, another week of the most disruptive show covering news and events and politics across these states, as well as across the surface of our divided globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, how's everybody doing this morning? Hope everybody's well. Let's get into the headlines. First up in COVID news, at least 1,875 new coronavirus deaths and 111,364 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Well, note, I'm just going to point this out again. It's a Monday. These days are usually slower. That is significantly lower than the numbers that we've been seeing recently. We've been seeing like mid 3,000 deaths, 4,000, approaching over 4,000 deaths a day. For a little while now. Over the past week, there has been an average of 148,444 cases per day. That's a decrease of 32% from the average 2 weeks earlier. Let's hope those keep decreasing. As of Monday morning, more than 26,216,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 441,000 have died from it. Federal Emergency Management Agency, that's FEMA, is now supporting vaccination efforts in Arizona, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Nevada, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington, after President Joe Biden ordered the government to get on a war footing in his mission to vaccinate 300 million Americans by summer's end. The agency, which has budgeted $1.2 billion for its COVID-19 mission, said it will reimburse states that deploy their National Guard troops to assist at vaccination sites. Yesterday, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and Chicago Public Schools CEO Dr. Janice Jackson insisted that teachers return to the classroom today amid the heated situation between CPS, Chicago Public Schools, and the union representing thousands of educators over the debate of resuming in-person learning around the coronavirus pandemic. For nearly an hour Saturday, over in Los Angeles, about 50 vaccination opponents and right-wing supporters of former President Donald Trump delayed COVID-19 vaccinations when they protested at the entrance to Dodger Stadium. Dodger Stadium is the site of a mass vaccination campaign. They held up signs that said things such as "COVID equals scam," "Don't be a lab rat," and "Tell Bill Gates to go vaccinate himself," quote unquote. The protesters caused the Los Angeles Fire Department to close the stadium entrance as a precaution. 10 Republican senators on Sunday announced plans to unveil a roughly $600 billion COVID-19 relief package. This is a counter-proposal to President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion plan. Lawmakers, including Senators Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Rob Portman of Ohio, told Biden in a letter that they devised the plan, quote, "in the spirit of bipartisanship and unity," end quote. The president has urged and said they plan to release a full proposal today. Their counterproposal includes a total of $160 billion for vaccine development and distribution, testing and tracing, and treatment and supplies, including the production and deployment of personal protective equipment. It also includes a new round of direct payments for, quote, "families who need assistance the most," end quote, extends enhanced federal unemployment benefits and at the current level, and provides $4 billion to bolster behavioral health and substance abuse. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, one of the Republicans who signed onto the letter, said the GOP plan includes payments starting at $1,000, an amount lower than the $1,400 Biden's plan provides for, that would decrease depending on an individual's income level. Jamarl, I know you were covering this over the weekend. What are your thoughts on this bill? Do you think this is any more likely? Do you think this is at all politically palatable? Or frankly, do you think that Biden should just be pushing his version of the bill through post-haste? What's your take?
Biden should push his version of the bill through post-haste. Look, this is too little. And if we think back to the Obama administration, do we think that the stimulus that Obama passed was too little or too much? Like, this is not a situation where it's too much, it's too little. And fact of the matter is, if Biden go down this road with Republicans, he could end up in a situation where it is insufficient to do what it needs it to do. And the only person who's going to get blamed for that is Biden and the Democrats, since they are the ones with the House, the presidency, and the Senate. So it's like, yeah, if you're going to be held to responsible for that, yeah, you push your own plan. I mean, what's the downside? You make your argument that you're fighting for America, and you go. That's my thought.
And I hear you. You know what? We got to get on with more of the headlines here. A lot of news today and over the weekend. Today, President Joe Biden will meet with the Republican senators who have drawn up the counter-proposal to his $1.9 trillion COVID-19 rescue plan. It's on this topic, of course. The senators said in a joint statement Sunday that they appreciated Biden's quick response to their proposal and had accepted an invitation to meet the president at the White House on Monday afternoon. Well, I'm curious how that meeting is going to go down. We'll find out very soon, of course. In national political news, speaking of the former president, Donald Trump, Trump's impeachment team has lost at least 3 of its lawyers after the former president reportedly asked them to focus on claims of voter fraud as part of his defense strategy. They were more keen on constitutional arguments. Trump advisor Jason Miller, however, has said the former president did not ask the lawyers to do so and that any suggestion otherwise was quote-unquote fake news. 2 new attorneys, David Schoen and Bruce Castor Jr., were named Sunday evening, just days before a pretrial brief is due for the impeachment trial that is set to begin in a week next Tuesday. A vote in the Senate last week showed that 45 Republicans believe impeaching a former president is unconstitutional. And by the way, those 3 were out of 5 that left the team overall. So basically his defense for the impeachment trial abandoned him. I don't know how else to put it. You know, they left in en masse right about a week before his trial is due to begin. Now, he has a couple of people to replace them, but that leaves his defense, I would say, in shambles. I don't see this going well, but on the other hand, at least 45 Republicans publicly have stated that they believe that impeaching the former president is unconstitutional. So it's, of course, you know, we'll see how it actually goes. Putting on your prognostication hat, Jamarl, how do you think this is going to go down? What do you think is going to happen in about a week, about 8 days from now?
He's not going to be impeached. I don't believe it. Like, I don't buy it. I think what's probably going to happen is, Democrats, of course, they're going to go through with it. But by the time it gets to the Republicans, especially in the Senate, they're going to basically ask this very specific question about whether or not they'll be negatively harmed by impeaching Trump. And I think some of them will consider themselves yes. And beyond that point, I don't think many of them even consider this to be impeachable. So I'm going to say no. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. I think basically it's going to die in the Senate and he's going to get off without a conviction. That's my thought. What do you think? Do you think there are enough votes to convict Trump in the Senate?
No, I think that you're right about this one, but we'll see. I'll admit, I am not the kind of person at this early stage in my sort of political prognostication career. I'm not comfortable making too bold a prediction on this stuff. I've been reading around, and as with so many things, opinions vary very widely, not only about whether it's possible, but whether it's probable, and certainly, of course, about whether it would be justified. But yeah, I just frankly don't know. But I think you're probably correct. I think that there are too many Republicans who don't want to follow along with this trend, and that more broadly, there's not enough political will, because I think the Democrats are worried that the Republicans will try to do this to them later too once they get back into the seat of power. Moving on with the news here, 21 men have accused John Weaver, the co-founder of Lincoln Project, of online harassment, including sexual harassment of young men in relationships that appear to have lasted years, starting with underage teenage boys and escalating to direct sexual requests after they reached the age of maturity. The Lincoln Project is, by the way, the largest new anti-Trump organization on the right wing. I saw you covering this over the weekend too, Jamarl. I know you have some thoughts on this. We were talking about this the other day. What do you think about this going down like this?
Yeah, this is disturbing. And it's funny. We were talking about, like, oftentimes people say there's a bias. Like, women get a pass more so if they're, going after younger men and that type of stuff. But in men, they're hit more harder by it. Maybe. But in this very specific case, you have a guy who is basically offering, let's say, favors, offering mentorship, handouts for, let's say, sexual favors or sexual attention. Shane, I don't know how much in the industry you want to get into politics, but there is clearly a sugar daddy out there that will be more than willing to give you a helping hand. This is weird, right? I mean, a lot of these people are like, we just wanted to get into politics and so forth. And he kept taking the conversation to sex. Yeah, very weird. Very weird. I think this story is going to get relatively big, especially with the Lincoln Project and this publicity that these guys got from basically taking liberals' money to make videos that liberals loved. So,
And here's one of the things I wonder. I wonder how long they had this information before they decided to release it now. We are on the other side of a Trump presidency. And of course, the Lincoln Project was on the right, one of the mainstay organizations. It was I would say the largest organization on the right wing that was explicitly and, avowedly from its foundation anti-Trump. And so you get where I'm going with this. They could have had this information for months, for a long time. And if they'd chosen to release it earlier, that potentially would have hurt charges against Trump. It might have weakened the anti-Trump base. And, who knows how much that would have swung the vote, but I think you get what I'm saying. I'm curious about it at the very least. Moving on, the only person charged in the Justice Department's investigation into the origins of the probe of former President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and its ties to Russia was spared prison time for altering an email used to support a surveillance application. It's former FBI attorney Kevin Kleinsmith received a sentence of 12 months probation and 400 hours community service from U.S. District Judge James Boasberg Friday during a video hearing. Kleinsmith, if you remember, is responsible for editing emails deceptively. Basically, it was centering on Carter Page, saying that he was not a source for the FBI when he was. So lying about him and in the process ruining the dude's career, trying to bolster the Russiagate probe. And this is John Durham's only charge so far. So the fact that he gets off light, the fact that he doesn't face prison time, which the Justice Department had recommended, is not a good look for them, in my opinion. And many Republicans are up in arms, frustrated with this. What's your take on this, Jamarl?
What was the last thing you said? Said it one more time.
I said many Republicans are up in arms, frustrated with this. I saw Lindsey Graham. I've seen others too. Chuck Grassley.
Yeah.
Pretty pissed about this.
I don't entirely have a strong point of view on this one. So I think it is a little, I don't have a strong view on this one. I'm going to hang out and wait for this. Because I do know we have people who we've talked to who, they have serious qualms with the way that the investigation went, especially with the Russiagate stuff. And so the idea that some people are perfectly okay to get pardons and whatnot, and others aren't. And then the question becomes, well, wait a minute, which people are and which people aren't, that type of stuff. Yeah, that stuff gets a little problematic. I mean, we're going to bring on Karyaku to talk about this. But yeah, it just seems like there are some people who benefit more than others, depending upon the way our system is organized. And so, yeah, I would imagine people are going to have some feelings about this, to put it mildly. 12 months probation, that's great.
Yeah. The dude, and this is, he pled guilty. This is, he deserves jail time. But we have other news to get to, so I'm going to get to it. Internationally, today, Myanmar's military-run television network reported the military had taken control of the country, declaring a state of emergency for 1 year, replacing the current government, which won in a sort of landslide in November's elections. These are amid reports that many of the country's senior politicians have been detained. It includes Aung San Suu Kyi, the state counselor, a position, by the way, which was created for her. We'll get to that a little bit later. The takeover was quickly condemned as a coup by the European Union and human rights groups, and the newly sworn-in administration of President Joe Biden in Washington expressed grave concern. They said they would be responding to this if the military did not stop what they were doing. A presenter on Myanmar's military-owned Myawaddy TV network announced the takeover and cited a section of the military-drafted constitution that allows the military to take control in times of national emergency. He said the takeover was in part due to the government's failure to act on the military's claims of voter fraud, again in last November's election, and its failure to postpone the election because of the coronavirus crisis. The whole thing is a mess. But again, the prime minister, effectively known as the state counselor, but effectively the position of prime minister, she has been detained. The president has reportedly been detained, and the military's head in chief, he has been put in charge. So it is effectively a coup. We want to cover this more a little bit later. In our next headline, former White House senior advisor Jared Kushner and his deputy Avi Berkowitz have been nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize for their roles helping to strike deals normalizing the relations between Israel and 4 Arab nations. The kicker, they were nominated by attorney Alan Dershowitz. He's a Harvard Law School lawyer. He's able to make that recommendation because he's professor emeritus at Harvard Law School. I mostly know Dershowitz. He's a longtime attorney. I mostly know him through Jeffrey Epstein, though, through the connections with Jeffrey Epstein and the reported receiving of massages naked massages. It's not trying to put that picture into your head, but there you go with Jeffrey Epstein.
Yeah, I remember
One last
that
quick
one.
headline here.
Yeah. I knew him before that. He was, like you said, litigation lawyer and everything else. But because we have a few more headlines. I'm sorry.
I do, yeah. Just one last quick one. In Russia, thousands were detained and then shortly after released this weekend as police responded to a wave of protests in dozens of cities across the country. Stimulated by the return of opposition figure Alexei Navalny, the protesters ranged in the tens of thousands from Siberia to St. Petersburg, driven by calls for unity and opposition to the government of Vladimir Putin and by charges of financial misconduct against the Russian president, centering on a Black Sea estate under construction that Navalny had alleged was owned by Putin in a popular YouTube documentary he and his team recently published. Russian businessman Arkady Rotenberg, by the way, has since claimed ownership of that property, potentially throwing a spanner into the works on that story. But we'll come back to that later. You're listening to Fault Lines. Those are our headlines, and we will be back in just a minute with Jamarl's Soapbox segment. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not-so-distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can join us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. And if you want to join in on the conversation, you can send us a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. So I think I did a piece making the point that get rid of the filibuster, do your job, meaning do the task that the American public put you in to do. Now, the reason I said that is because at the end of the day, the goal is not defense. The goal is to try to get your items and your agenda accomplished, especially the ones that you told America that you were going to do. And honestly, given the last administration, meaning the Obama administration, the last Democratic administration, you would think at this point that would be understood. Meaning, you would think that after the Obama administration, this unyielding opposition to Obama, as it was called, when Newt Gingrich and the other Republicans licking their wounds decided that they were either going to work with the president or work against the president. And because Obama basically say, I am above politics, I am going to be above it all, I'm going to be bipartisan, I'm going to reach across the aisle, this is not red and blue America, et cetera, et cetera. Because of that, what did they do? They hit him on this notion of bipartisanship. Because the fact of the matter is, it takes two to have bipartisanship. You can't have a situation where one guy wants to be bipartisan and the other one just keeps backing away, which is basically what you ended up with in the Obama administration. You had Obama basically fighting on his own 50-yard line, meaning arguing and debating with themselves, knocking down their own policy proposals, especially his big-ticket proposal on the issue of healthcare. Rob Portman made the point. He says, Mr. Portman warned against going that route. Now, the route that he's talking about is basically going it alone. Biden's plan, I think, is $1.9 trillion. Republicans put out a plan that is basically a third of that plan. And in doing that, Portman is basically making the point that says, look, if you want to push through your $1.9 trillion, if you're going to go without us on that, you're going to poison the well. Quote, this will set President Biden down a path of partisanship that will poison the well. Poison the well. think about what we're saying for the moment. They want, all of a sudden, bipartisanship. It's funny how Republicans all of a sudden believe in the cult of bipartisanship after losing the House, the Senate, and the presidency. When did you start believing that? It seemed like that happened the moment that you lost also the Senate. Yes, I've lost my job, but I 1,000% prodigiously want to pay off this bill right now. When Republicans tried to kill Obamacare, eliminating health care for tens of millions of people, there was no bipartisan support. None. Zero. When they passed that grotesque tax cut. None. When Trump wanted to build a wall. None. I'm making the point that they had no issue. Zero. With going it alone. And yet, you have situations where Democrats often will get into basically negotiating on their own 50-yard line despite being given a mandate. Why do I say it's a mandate? Think of Georgia for the moment. When is the last time Georgia went to a Democrat president, or for that matter, runoff? And you can make a point that says, yes, the $2,000 that Joe Biden said he was going to give, that had a lot to do with it, and it did. But that had nothing to do with Biden getting elected. Biden got elected beforehand, and that was, again, somewhat of a sea change. I'm making the point, it's a mandate. When you have something like that take place in the context of a massive, massive pandemic with all of these people in dire straits and whatnot, and they give you the House, the Senate, and the presidency, the expectation is that you articulate that power for their interests. Did you believe it or not? Did you believe in the $15 minimum wage or not? Did you believe in putting a public option or not? And the reality of it is that $1.9 trillion is the least you could do. Stephanie Kelton made the point that says, yeah, this is a floor. This is not a ceiling. And the object of this needs to be to fix and to ameliorate some of the worst edges of the system, especially after COVID. The people who were hit hardest by it were the people who could afford to be hit the least. And yet, our society, our country keeps ticking along. If Democrats honestly believe that Republicans are going to back the $15 minimum wage, then I have property on the moon to sell them, waterfront at that. The point I'm trying to make here is, when Obama was fighting under Obamacare, Obama was doing everything he could to get help from one of the other Republicans to sign in. And what happened? They never did. He watered down that policy over and over and over again, finally not having, any support from the Republicans to pass it. I'm making the point that if Joe Biden, unless Joe Biden wants to deal with the same fate, he better, heaven and earth, to pass the agenda for the American public. He told people 2,000, all of a sudden that got pushed down to 1,400, and all of a sudden that's negotiable. That doesn't look good. And fact of the matter is, from the Republican strategy standpoint, if we can pull you closer to us, then two things will take place. Either what you're doing from the standpoint of legislation will be magnificently insufficient, which means you may lose anyway for not dealing and attending to the issues and the needs of the public, or, for that matter, you may get into a situation of just unyielding opposition otherwise. I'm making the point that from Biden's standpoint, his objective, his goal, his only mission needs to not be part of this cult of bipartisanship, but to actually get done what was necessary for the American public to ameliorate these hard edges. And if you did that, you wouldn't have to worry about losing the Senate or losing the House in the next elections, because at the very least, they would believe that you got their back and you're fighting for America. I want to play this clip by Sanders because this clip nails it. It's not about bipartisanship. It's about whether or not you can deliver for the public. And if you need $10 to live off and somebody give you $8, $8 is nice, but it's not enough to live off. There's some things that you can get that are just insufficient. And the point of the matter is, if you got to go it alone, you go it alone. Let's play the clip from Sanders.
Is it a mistake for Democrats to consider abandoning bipartisanship negotiations so soon?
Martha, the issue is not, bipartisanship or not. The issue is, are we going to address the incredible set of crises and the pain and the anxiety which is in this country? You know what? I don't care what anybody says. We have got to deal with this pandemic. We have got to make sure that we are producing the vaccines that we need and get those vaccines into the arms of people. We cannot have children in America going hungry, people being evicted, schools not open. We need to open our schools in a safe way. That's what we have to do. So the question is not bipartisanship. The question is addressing the unprecedented crises that we face right now. If Republicans want to work with us, they have better ideas on how to address those crises, that's great. But to be honest with you, I have not yet heard that.
Yeah, I haven't heard that either. And like I said, the 1.9 trillion should be a floor, not a ceiling. And fact of the matter is the amount that you're going to spend from the standpoint of stimulus is entirely dependent upon what your society needs. It's not an ideological number, meaning it's not, I'm going to go with 600 billion because I don't necessarily want to give this money out. No, if you're in the midst of a crisis, then it behooves your government to spend to the degree that it needs to spend to ameliorate the crisis. The money is not real. The human beings are. The money is not real. The eviction and living on the street, that's real. I'm making the point that human beings and the things that affect human beings, especially in the context of this particular society, should be dealt with. It is the job of government to deal with that stuff. And putting it off and saying, well, this is too expensive, doesn't fly. Sanders is right. The issue is not about bipartisanship. The issue is whether or not you're going to accomplish what you're going to accomplish for the American public and whether you're going to do what you said you were going to do. That's what it boils down to. Shane, what do you think? Is it an issue of bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship, or you have to go it alone? I mean, because sometimes I might make a deal with you under the guise or under the idea that you can't accept it. Does it make sense? Like, we can get into a negotiation where it's purely political, where you can't accept what I'm giving or vice versa, but you're giving it for that very specific point. Or for that matter, or that it's not enough. Where the other way, you're going to get hit in the electorate when they look at it as your fault because you have the House, the presidency, and the Senate. So what do you think?
I'll put it like this. I'll say the same thing. I'm just going to throw a couple of devil's advocate arguments in here. And some of them, I'll leave it a mystery which ones I genuinely believe. For one thing, I will make the same argument when Republicans are in power. I'm making it now. Isn't democracy in some sense about compromise? Like, here's the thing. If you have this pendulum swinging from one party's control to the other party's control, then what you get over time is an increasingly disjointed, fragmented government with sclerotic responses to different forms of crisis. Whereas if you have a government that can effectively come to compromise, and that is its own big if, then what you get is a more or less continuous stream of decisions that accord with one another over time. Now that might sound slightly utopian after the back and forth that we've seen over recent decades, but still, that's the hope, certainly. And if we get used to this idea that whichever party is in control is just going to completely railroad, steam through and ignore what the other side wants to say, then isn't that bad for our government? That's argument one. I will give you time to respond. I just want to throw these in here real quick. Argument two is more money is not necessarily a better thing if that money is going to the wrong places, if it's lining the pockets of billionaires. So 600 billion versus 1.9 trillion is a pretty big difference between where those bills are being spent. But there's no guarantee that 1.3 trillion that's included in Biden's bill is going to lining the pockets of your average taxpayer. It might be going to increase the financial system's degree of sort of stability, this quasi illusory system of stocks and trade and amplified, bloated, overinflated stock prices that we have. It might just be going to keep that afloat, and it might be going to lining the pockets of state politicians, et cetera. So I'm not 100% convinced that more money is necessarily a better thing. I think you'd need to make that argument. Certainly more help would be a better thing. And if that's what it amounts to, then that's great. But can you really look at Biden's administration, and do you really think that that's the first thing on his mind? That's the first thing on the mind, the minds of the people who are writing this stuff up, is making sure that the average taxpayer, that the average just person, the average civilian, whether they have a house or not, like to bring that into it. Do you think they really care, or do you think they're using that as moral cover while on the back end they do what they can to make their benefactors richer? Jamarl.
I don't think it matters. I think that's politics. And there's a few points. I have to believe that the opposition is being loyal opposition and working in good faith. I don't believe that. And beyond that point, I mean, these are the same people who tried to get rid of Obamacare, that were going to get rid of 20 million people from healthcare. This wasn't a bipartisan thing. I agree with you on the notion of that we shouldn't just ram stuff through. Fair enough. But by the same token, we also shouldn't be stagnant by a political party or political parties that are against those things, especially if it's in the American public's interests or wants. Like, I can go down the list and show you one item after the next that the American public agrees with that neither party backs. And so I understand the idea that we should come together, but this can't be a cultish behavior. It can't be bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship. It has to be with the idea of getting something accomplished where one side is loyal opposition, but the other side pushes, ideally, America's agenda. So I don't believe in bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship. As for Biden helping the people, I don't think that matters. Ultimately, I think there's a certain pressure on Biden when he gets in that he has to do something. Because think of the arguments that these guys were making under Trump. He's a clown, he failed, et cetera, et cetera. So all the pressure in the world is on Biden to try to remedy this issue.
But what
as
leverage?
Soon as possible.
Jamarl, we got to come back to this later, but I'm going to quote you. What leverage do we have over him to make him do that? That's the thing, is going into a Biden presidency. I'm going to remind you where you were. What leverage does the average person, what leverage do slightly more fringe figures on the left, what leverage do folks have to hold Biden to that account? Or is he just in the presidency now? He's going to have the media. He's going to have the approval of most folks regardless. What leverage do we really have over him?
None.
More for later.
It's that. None. But the only thing, but I guess my difference is, or the thing I'm thinking about this is, the left has no pressure or leverage over Biden. But if Biden fails, he will lose the House, the Senate, and eventually the presidency. That's the leverage per se, but that's an American public leverage. That's not, that's the American public looking at Biden and saying Biden failed at his task. That's not the left having leverage or any individual having leverage, if that makes sense. But let's do this. Let's take a break. We'll come back. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment with Peter Oliver. That should be a good one.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
In a media landscape filled with so-called journalists acting as stenographers for their billionaire bosses, there is a desperate need for news, analysis, and perspectives that buck the status quo and get to the heart of how domestic and international events impact you and me, as well as showing how we can get involved in the struggle to change that status quo. Check out By Any Means Necessary on Radio Sputnik, Monday through Friday from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, to hear the stories and voices that mainstream media refuses to tell you. And join us as we connect the political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us. That's By Any Means Necessary, Monday through Friday at 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern, right here on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Peter Oliver, EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. Peter, thank you for joining us. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thanks very much for having me back. Nice to be here.
Absolutely. So I've been paying attention to what has been going on in the EU, especially around the idea of Brexit and around the idea of vaccinations and whatnot. It is very interesting and very weird. We're getting into this odd thing of like vaccine nationalism in somewhat of a weird way. Could you explain the relationship between the EU and the UK, basically what took place in regards to the issue with vaccinations and supplying those vaccinations over the course of the weekend? Let's say the row
interesting
or the
and weird. Interesting and weird is certainly one way to put it. It's been an absolute shambles, and it continues to be so. What we have is essentially a three-way dispute between the European Union, the United Kingdom, and AstraZeneca, the pharmaceutical giant that manufactures one of the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, AstraZeneca had agreed deals with both the United Kingdom and the European Union to provide vaccines. Initially, the EU had been told back in August when they signed their deal that they would get 100 million, perhaps 120 million doses of this vaccine in the first quarter of 2021. In December, they were told, actually, it's probably going to be closer to 80 million. And then on the 22nd of January, they were told 31 million doses, a considerable drop-off. That prompted a lot of questions being asked from the EU side. These vaccines were being manufactured at factories in the United Kingdom, as well as in the EU, but the majority of the production was going on in the United Kingdom. The EU understood that it would get vaccines that were being manufactured in the UK. As far as the UK were concerned, that wasn't on the cards at all. As far as the London was concerned, anything manufactured in the UK was going to the UK because the United Kingdom signed a contract with AstraZeneca long before the European Union did. So what happened is this all came to a head on Friday. The European Union said it was going to put restrictions in place that could stop vaccines manufactured in the EU going anywhere else, pretty much targeted at the United Kingdom. And then on Friday evening, something we didn't expect to happen did happen. The European Union announced that it was going to invoke Article 16 of the Brexit Agreement. What this would do would put in place border checks on the UK border on the island of Ireland. That's the border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
Which destroys the Good Friday Agreement. That entirely destroys the Good Friday
Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement puts the fragile peace in Northern Ireland at risk, and managed I think it was 3 to 4 hours this lasted, this was the news that it was going to happen. It managed to unite Republicans, Unionists, London, Dublin, the Democratic Unionist Party, and Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin even to a certain extent. So this is probably the only thing that's ever united all of these different parts, moving parts in the Northern Ireland issue, united them in a look at the EU, and in particular at Ursula von der Leyen, the EU Commission President, of what the heck are you doing? So there was an embarrassing climb down. Anyway, on Friday evening,
it sounds like it, Peter. Yeah. Peter, you're not like a staunchly pro-Brexit guy. We've only had you on the one time before, but last time we had you on, I recall you were broadly in favor of a lot of the stuff that the EU was doing. You were very critical of them for how they've handled, certain aspects of this crisis, the vaccination, what we're talking about. But it's not like you're speaking this as somebody who goes out to the pub to have drinks with Farage pretty frequently.
Me and Nigel have had. I say Nigel. I've interviewed him once. It was fiery. No, I would say I voted Remain. I live here in Berlin. I'm British by birth. You can be very much in favour of the European Union. You can think Brexit was a terrible idea and still acknowledge that not only has the European Union failed to handle vaccine procurement correctly, but that what happened on Friday was really a catastrophic failure of diplomacy, of leadership, of the ability to grasp what is the biggest medical and logistical crisis of a generation. And I mean, just before I came to speak to you, I was listening to the press briefing going on in Brussels, and the poor press spokesperson from the European Commission who had to field questions. It was asked, how did Article 16 almost get invoked on Friday night? He acknowledged it was a mistake, but could only really back it up by saying, look, and I quote this, only the Pope is infallible. They realized they made a mistake, and Ursula von der Leyen is finding herself very much in the firing line at the moment. Whether there will be calls for her to go, I mean, there are calls for her to go, but serious calls for her to consider her position, I don't think so. But her commission, her leadership has taken a massive blow over what happened on Friday evening.
Well, this devastates trust. I mean, that's what it basically boils down to. I mean, these guys just had the Brexit divorce, and they're already basically trying to invoke, this article already. I remember when the Brexit negotiations was initially taking place, the EU was very clear that they weren't going to negotiate if it was going to in any way harm or jostle the Good Friday Agreement. And now, all of a sudden, when the vaccines come into play, bam, willing to do it in a heartbeat. So what is going to be the consequences from the standpoint of, I don't want to say bad faith, it's not the term bad faith, but from the standpoint of, I guess, trust in the relationship between these two parties now? I mean, it seems like that would be frayed tremendously at this point.
Well, yes. The British government so far has been very keen to talk about a resetting of relations over this issue. That was the words coming out on Sunday. But they allowed the British media to do the savaging of the EU Commission and of Ursula von der Leyen. The pro-Brexit media in the UK, they had a field day. I mean, all of their beliefs have been backed up by this. We heard a lot from the United States, the phrase, but what about her emails? This is now that for the Brexit debate. But what about the Article 16? What about the vaccine procurement? Because the European Union, unfortunately, has, they've eroded the trust of the British people in what, they've eroded the trust that's going to be there between an independent UK and the European Union, but they've also shown a lot of those who campaigned very hard for Brexit. See, look, this is what we told you about them. This is what they'll do. This is what they can do. And it's, I still think the overwhelming amount of evidence there shows that Brexit isn't that beneficial at all in the longest in the wider game. But this is a colossal failure on behalf of good faith, on behalf of trust for the future, on behalf of the ability to show that things that should be sacrosanct, like the Good Friday Agreement, that the EU is willing, at what is essentially the first sign of trouble, to throw that under the bus.
And of course, then they walk that back very quickly, but that doesn't make them look better either. How seriously, in your opinion, does this imperil the relationship between Ireland and the EU going forward, Peter?
Micheál Martin, the Taoiseach in Ireland, the head of government, the Prime Minister, wasn't told, apparently, this was going to happen. I was speaking to some Irish colleagues in Brussels and asking them what were they getting from those in the know that they're a little bit closer to than I am here in Berlin. People weren't happy. They were not happy at all. This made the relationship will be fine because Ireland is a crucial part of the European Union. They on the European stage, Ireland, a country of just under 5 million people, is able to punch far above its weight on the international stage. And being a part of the European Union overall has been something of a benefit, I would have said, for the Republic of Ireland. I'm sure that I'm going to be criticised for saying that, but if we take that as a given. But yeah, this erodes trust, no doubt, on all sides, whether it's between London and the EU or whether it's between Dublin and Brussels over this whole situation.
Peter, we have about 30 seconds before we go into a break, but we're 45 seconds. But I want to get to, for a moment, how do they pay for this? Like, how do they pay for the vaccines in the European Union? How do they allocate those resources and send it out, since the EU have very strict budgeting guidelines?
Yeah, well, yes. I mean, it has very strict budgeting guidelines, but it has large budgets as well. All member states contribute to the pot. And the idea was that Brussels, the European Commission, would procure vaccines on behalf of all 27 member states and distribute them evenly so that larger countries like Germany, where I am, couldn't jump in and buy a whole load of vaccines, and smaller countries like, say, Ireland or even Estonia, that they would be left without. So that was the idea of this whole centralized procurement method. They paid, actually, the EU paid some 336, I believe, million euro back in August for these 100 million doses of the vaccine that they've been told they're not going to get.
Wow. Wow. You guys are listening. The voice that you guys were listening to is Peter Oliver, EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of politics or political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault lines. Shooting from the left.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Peter Oliver. He is the EU correspondent for RT International. He provides daily coverage of political, diplomatic, and economic news from across the European Union. And by the way, you can and you should follow him on Twitter at @PeterGOliver_RT. That's over on Twitter. Again, Peter, thank you so much for sticking with us. Glad to continue this conversation. About a month ago, we were having a conversation with a chap from Britain, from England, and we were talking about the sort of mood at the time, and it was grim. Lockdowns reimposed shortly before the conversation began within the previous couple of days, and he was saying that people were basically tired of it, as many are, admittedly, across the globe. Here's where I'm going with this, though. The EU's vaccination response is much, much weaker than the UK's vaccination response so far. And I can't help but think that for some people looking across the channel, they're glad they're on the northern side of it. They're glad that they're in the UK because, they have vaccines on the way, much more vaccine distribution than the EU. I'm just curious, what's the mood like right now? How do you think people are feeling about the state of affairs? Do they feel any better about Boris Johnson's response now that they see how lackluster the European Union's has been? Peter?
The vaccine program in the United Kingdom has been an undoubted success, but it does cover over the fact that the United Kingdom has the highest death rate in Europe. Over 100,000 people have died in the UK with COVID-19. And as much as the vaccine program will be trumpeted for the success that it is, there's I was about to say people will recognize that there has been colossal failures, but I'm just remembering the polling that I saw yesterday from the UK that actually showed the Conservatives are up in the polls considerably on Labour. I think they got a 4% kick last week. So despite the death rate being terrible, the vaccine program seems to have gone down particularly well with people. And if you look at the figures, the vaccine program is by far and away the success story for the UK. According to, if they continue at the current rates, the UK will have vaccinated 70% of the population, which is what's said to be the magic number in order to basically eradicate the virus without getting into something that I don't understand. I'm certainly no epidemiologist, and I will always endeavor to try to pretend I'm not to pretend I'm
definitely not one either, but I think I might. I think you're talking. This is not exactly herd immunity, but this is the idea that if you vaccinate a sufficiently large number of the population, that they're basically going to have a hard time spreading it to other people, and so it's
70.
The rate of infection goes down.
70% seems to be that magic figure. The current numbers, if they continue vaccinating the way they're going in the UK, they'll have achieved that by August of this year. If you look at Germany, we're talking about them, if they continue at the same rate as they're doing now, which would be unacceptable to everybody, you're looking at December 2023. Now, that obviously there's no way that that's going to be allowed to happen. But just to tell you who's bottom of the class in the European Union when it comes to that, that's the Netherlands. If they were to continue at their current rate, which is so low, they wouldn't have vaccinated 70% of the Netherlands population, which has a very small population. I think it's around, I'm going to go out on a limb and say 6-7 million, 5 million to 7 million. They wouldn't have vaccinated 70% until September 2033. So the lag behind the way European vaccination programs have gone compared to the United Kingdom, there's a gulf that is, well, almost spanning 10 years of 20 years nearly of what they're going to be doing there. There's a big problem in Europe with vaccines. And if you look at the more here and now, instead of looking what's coming in the future, in France, in Portugal, and in Spain, they've had to suspend vaccination because they just don't have enough of the jabs to be able to keep a full program running out. So they've suspended certain parts of it. It is a success, the vaccination program in the UK. Does it make up for the failings that the government have put in place beforehand? Well, it seems it would with the electorate that were polled most recently, but I think there's still there is calls for investigations to come over the mistakes that have been made that have led to so many deaths, and for the United Kingdom leading the way when it comes to COVID deaths in Europe.
Yeah, the EU and the members of member states, they would have to be apoplectic at this point, seeing, like you said, the shambolic situations that all of this seems to be in. Angela Merkel is supposed to convene a meeting with Big Pharma in order to try to get them to increase, the number of vaccines that will be made available. What is the perspective of the European populace on this entire thing? Because like Europe, like you said, each country, well, I don't know if you said it, but each country has their own particular politics on some level. And I would imagine you have the Eurosceptics and people who are less Eurosceptic. When this argument is being played out, or when this is like hit across the headlines, I would imagine this is a scandal. What is the politics of the various, governments within the European Union and the people in those governments, or for that matter, the public itself, and how they see what is taking place in Europe?
Well, look, it's the same as those in the United Kingdom that fully supported Brexit look at the failings of the European Union as backing up the reason why they voted Brexit or supported Brexit. Those Eurosceptics in the EU, and it's not just the Eurosceptics, as I said, it is very possible to be incredibly pro-European, yet incandescent at the failings of the EU over the vaccine program, and that is bearing out. We've seen opposition parties here in Germany unhappy with the way that the government has handled things. They've been unhappy in their own different ways. The Green Party were particularly unhappy with the fact that Germany unilaterally introduced bans on travel from certain countries over the weekend, whereas the Free Democrats, who are a more classically liberal, business-minded party, they've been deeply unhappy with the lockdown measures that have been rolled out across the country and continue to stay in place across the country. And that is bearing out in all member states, in all the different countries who have their the particular colours, the particular slants of politics. You're seeing similar trends with some people unhappy at the lockdown measures that have been taken. We saw huge demonstrations in some places over the weekend. In Austria, there was a large demonstration took place in Belgium. Excuse me. In Belgium, there was around 200 arrests made around the centre of the city after demonstrations against COVID measures there.
Well, I guess what I'm getting at, Peter, is what do you expect to happen? Like, is there enough, impetus and pressure from this failure in order to kind of change or shake up the European Union and how it's arranged, or the politics in the various countries? I guess that's what I'm getting at more specifically.
EU reform. Oh dear, that's been a subject for the longest times. Will this be the thing that finally reforms the EU? If I was to, I would like to think yes. I honestly think no. I honestly think the status quo will continue. There may be some kind of shake-up within internally over what's happened because of the vaccine procurement, but I can't see there being a huge change in the way the EU operates, just based on this one, albeit huge, mess up over vaccines. There's not going to. I just can't see it. It's going to continue the way it is for a while.
Okay, back to vaccines for a minute here. Isn't it, so the vaccine nationalism is the term that's been getting thrown around for almost a year now, since I believe that the World Health Organization, the UN, together started to talk about this and complain about the prospect that as we're seeing to this day, that many individual countries who have developed or manufactured their own vaccines choose to keep them for personal use on a nationwide scale and not to distribute them more widely globally. Now, the concern at that point, if you remember, was that like developing nations wouldn't get access to them. So poorer countries who couldn't manufacture or develop the vaccines on their own, that they wouldn't be the recipients of this widespread worldwide distribution that many were hoping and planning for. And yet, it's remarkable to see the European Union, one of the mainstays on the international stage geopolitically, not getting this. That's sort of an aside. With the AstraZeneca vaccine particularly, that was developed in coordination with Oxford University. Wasn't it predictable that this kind of event would happen? Why didn't the EU prepare for this, Peter?
That's a big, big question. And that's one of those that I certainly think will be heading the way of Ursula von der Leyen in the coming weeks. She was speaking on German TV last night and was asked many a question about just that, about why didn't you prepare earlier for this? Well, she insists that they did prepare well within time. But if you look at what the United Kingdom did, they implemented emergency measures that all member states and the EU in general, they could have done what the UK did and give emergency approval to vaccines in order to push them through. They didn't. And that's why they found themselves in this situation. Now, when it comes to vaccines going to developing countries, there's a wonderful quote that was doing the rounds yesterday, and I can't remember who it was from, when they said that these big nations, these big blocs, including the European Union, they're, instead of wanting to increase the pie, as it were, for the globe, to be everybody to be able to get a slice, they're fighting over the lion's share of everything, including the crumbs. And that is ultimately going to lead to developing nations not getting vaccines for a long, long time. I mean, that does leave, and what seems to be leaving the market open for both the Russian Sputnik vaccine and the Chinese developed vaccine, which are being sold in increasing numbers in developing nations. But I think we're also going to see that it seems the Sputnik vaccine is expected to get approval by the European Medicines Agency here in Europe as well, and we'd expect to see that being part of the vaccine menu that continues across Europe. But there is a huge problem because until all nations have this vaccine, then nobody's particularly safe at all, because everybody needs to be vaccinated because of the nature of the world, that we all move about so much. We saw this in how quickly the virus spread around the planet, that these vaccines are needed on a global scale. And in order to do that, I think there does need to be some heads banged together at the highest levels possible to make sure that the idea of vaccine nationalism isn't something we continue to have to talk about. There's no winners until we all win.
Peter, we have about 30 seconds or 45 seconds. What is the thing that concerns you the most going forward? Meaning, as you sit in your perch, looking out at the world.
Vaccine nationalism. The idea of we beat them, we did this first, because it's not about doing it first, it's about doing it right. And right means getting it to everybody. And yeah, that vaccine nationalism, I think, is one of the biggest threats to us right now of getting back to some sense of normality from this pandemic.
Peter, where can people find your stuff, Peter, just before we close? I like to...
RT, on RT, I'm not sure how it's watched in the US. I haven't been for a while, but RT.com, you'll see me there. Or on Twitter, it's Peter G. Oliver _RT. There will be a lot of soccer in there as well. I apologize for that already.
No, you're fine.
No need to apologize.
No, thank you for coming on, Peter. The voice that you guys were listening to is Peter Oliver, EU correspondent for RT International, providing daily coverage of political, diplomatic, economic news from across the European Union. And as he said, you can find him on Twitter at Peter G. Oliver _RT, and catch us reporting weekly on RT International. Shane, great convo. I was in the EU, I think it was a few years ago, and I remember meeting a guy in Germany who was British, and he basically lived there. He was talking, him and I got into this really good conversation about Brexit and what it meant, all that stuff. Utterly fascinating conversation. So I'm glad that Peter Oliver can basically come in and give us a bird's eye view from on the ground on that.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, and one quick note, by the way, we was talking about the V vaccine from Russia. They have offered up 100 million doses of the vaccine. That's enough for 50 million people, well over 10% of the population of the EU as a whole, by the second quarter of this year. So it doesn't necessarily have to be decades. I'm not saying they're the only one, But we'll come back to that at some other point. Closing this hour out, we will be back in just a minute with headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
That will mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 1,875 new coronavirus deaths and 111,364 new cases were reported in the United States on January 31st. Over the past week, there's been an average of 148,444 cases per day, a decrease of 32% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday morning, more than 26,216,600 people in the United States have been infected with coronavirus. Over 441,000 have died from it. I know I keep pointing this out, but the 1875, usually on the weekend, for whatever reason, that number drops. And by the time we get to Wednesday, that number seems to go up. We'll see if that pattern remains. I would imagine when that number starts going down in earnest, that pattern breaks down. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, is now supporting vaccination efforts in Arizona, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Nevada, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington after President Joe Biden ordered the government to get on a war footing in its mission to vaccinate 300 million Americans by summer's end. The agency, which has budgeted $1.2 billion for its COVID-19 mission, said it will reimburse states that will deploy their National Guard troops to assist at vaccination sites. Good. Yesterday, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and Chicago Public Schools CEO Dr. Janice Jackson insisted that teachers return to classrooms today amid the heated situation between CPS and the union representing thousands of educators over the debate in resuming in-person learning amid the coronavirus pandemic. For nearly an hour Saturday, about 50 vaccination opponents and right-wing supporters of President Donald Trump delayed COVID-19 vaccinations when the protests at the entrance to Dodger Stadium, the site of mass vaccination campaign, holding signs that said such things as COVID equals scam, don't be a lab rat, and tell Bill Gates to go vaccinate himself. The protesters caused the Los Angeles Fire Department to close the stadium entrance as a precaution. That is so sad. If you don't want to take the vaccine yourself, fair enough. Understood, totally. But the idea that 440,000 people have dropped dead, and in the context of that, there are people holding signs saying this is a scam, this isn't real, don't get the vaccine. That is like a whole nother level of extra dimensional ridiculousness. But here we are. 10 Republican senators on Sunday announced plans to unveil a roughly $600 billion COVID-19 relief package, a counterproposal to President Joe Biden's $1.9 trillion plan. The lawmakers, including Senator Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Rob Portman of Ohio, told Biden in a letter that they devised the plan, quote, in the spirit of bipartisanship and unity, unquote, that the president has urged and say that they plan to release a full proposal today. The counterproposal includes a total of $160 billion for vaccine development and distribution, testing and tracing, and treatment and supplies, including the production and deployment of personal protective equipment. It also includes a new round of direct stimulus or direct payments for, quote, families who need assistance the most, unquote, extends enhanced federal unemployment benefits at the current level and provides $4 billion to bolster behavioral health and substance abuse. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, one of the Republicans who signed onto the letter, said the GOP plan includes payments starting at $1,000, an amount lower than the $1,400 Biden plan provide, that would decrease depending on the individual's income level. Today, President Joe Biden will meet with the Republican senators who have drawn up the counterproposal to the $1.9 trillion COVID plan. Now, the senators said in a joint statement Saturday that they appreciate Mr. Biden's quick response to their proposal and had accepted an invitation to meet with the president at the White House on Monday afternoon. Trump's impeachment, and by the way, real quick, it's amazing how fast bipartisanship comes into practice when these guys lose it all. And they weren't thinking of this bipartisanship stuff under the Trump administration, per se, unless you were being bipartisan with their side of the equation or their side of the argument. So, yes, bipartisanship is not bad. Bipartisanship for the sake of bipartisanship, no. Trump impeachment team has lost at least 3 of its lawyers after the former president reportedly asked them to focus on claims of voter fraud as part of his defense strategy. Trump advisor Jason Miller said the former president did not ask the lawyers to do so, and any suggestion otherwise was, quote, fake news, unquote. 2 new attorneys, David Schone and Bruce Castor Jr., were named Sunday evening, just days before the pre-trial brief is due for the impeachment trial that was set to begin a week next Tuesday. A vote in the Senate last week showed that 45 Republicans believe impeaching a former president is unconstitutional. What about you, Shane? Is impeaching a former president unconstitutional? I've heard the arguments for it. I mean, I know some of this they were arguing to prevent him from ever coming back. And so, what do you think? Is it unconstitutional, or is this just the argument that these guys are going with to kind of save face for acquitting?
Hell, man, I'm not a constitutional lawyer. I'm not the dude to answer this question. And frankly, I don't think it's going to matter. Isn't the whole point at this point that you can revise/reinterpret the Constitution when it's most desperately needed just to get what you want politically? Isn't that where we are?
Yeah, it is. I mean, but I would argue it was always that way. I mean, it's a subjective document, and that document is going to be, have to grow and change according to our times. I mean, this gets to the whole argument we were having with the constitutional gentleman. I can't think of his name. I could see him, but I can't think of his name.
Daniel Lazare.
Yeah, Lazare.
Daniel Lazare.
Exactly. Where his point is, it's like, look, this government has gotten to the point where you can't change it. Like, you have a list of things that the public wants, that the public needs, that would cut down on death, suicides, drug abuse. Like, these are things that we can deal with, but we don't, because we can't get a consensus.
Didn't you just say that it's always been the case that we have changed it?
But it seems like it gets worse. I mean, am I wrong on that? It seems like with the people, because it seems like it's undetached from what the public wants at this point. And it didn't seem to be that way under FDR or Eisenhower or, even up to the point before Clinton. I mean, even Nixon, right-wing Richard Nixon, passed he was talking about a reverse income tax. He was even talking about, and this is right-winger, bombings and everything else. Even he was receptive. Ralph Nader gets him to pass, the environmental protection thing. And so it just seems like at some point it became entirely undetached from what the public wants and the public interests. Or do you see it that way?
But maybe the public has become detached from the Constitution, and maybe that's inevitable. I don't freaking know. But here's the thing, man. If you start talking about the Constitution, chances are, unless you're pushing for your political cure to whatever problem you see, that's a shibboleth. That's a sign that you're like on a sort of legalistic part of the right wing. That's what it has become. Unless you're literally a judge or a lawyer who's having to make those cases, or unless you're following some key political issue that's in the news and you're saying this is constitutional, that's not constitutional, etc. Most folks just don't seem to care about it. And again, that's a problem. That is the cause of a problem. That's the results of a problem. I'm not trying to make a big beef about it, but maybe the reason that it doesn't seem to matter is that we don't actually care about it as much as we used to.
Whether something is unconstitutional? I don't know.
Yes.
I mean, I don't think we'd have all of this consternation in the society if people didn't care. Because, I guess that's the way I see it. I mean, I don't think it's Meaning, I think the reason that people are protesting, either the BLM stuff or even the White House thing, I don't think these things speak of a healthy society per se. And, is it part and parcel because of this decapitation between what the public wants versus what the political instrument delivers? I would wager to some degree it is. Like, I don't know if the public, like all things being equal, if you gave the public its druthers, what would it say it wanted? And does the political branch in any way give those things? And I got to be honest, it doesn't seem like it does. And I guess I get the feeling that it wasn't always that way. But we have a few more. But I feel you. It's a fair point to say, well, the public is detached from that stuff on its own. Fair enough. I don't know if I entirely buy that one, though. But that's fair. 21 men have accused John Weaver, the co-founder of Lincoln Project, of online harassment, including sexual harassment of young men in relationships that appear to have lasted years, starting with underage teenage boys and escalating to direct sexual requests after they have reached the age of maturity. The Lincoln Project is the largest new anti-Trump organization on the right wing. I followed the story over the weekend. This is rough. Shane, I sent you this one because this one was pretty bad. Basically, grooming young men, basically offering mentorship, help in the industry. There were even talks where the guy was saying he kept taking it to sex, even though I just wanted to have a conversation about, work and whatnot in politics. Where's the line on this? Now, this guy seemed to have gone across that line. But let's say he didn't go across the line. Let's say everybody he made those passes at were 18 or above. Would it have been okay? Is it still a situation of a person using their power and authority to basically extort favors from, let's say, people who are in a less favorable spot? Or it's free will. You choose who you want. Like, which way do you trend on this one?
I think he was grooming them. I think that's the way that you see it. If you start from when they're teenage years, and then as you're asking them when they're going to turn 18, you're checking in on them every once in a while to see if they've reached the age of majority yet. And then once they have, you start pushing for sexual favors. That's grooming. There was a whole movement about this a couple of years ago that we seem to have forgotten about, the whole Me Too thing. And it applies to men as well. And if you're grooming somebody from a young age in exchange for political favors, that's grooming that borders on illegal behavior if it's not illegal in itself. And again, what I'm wondering about is how long did they know about this? For how long has this information been held back until it was released at this point on this side of the election? Because, it's an anti-Trump group that this guy co-founded. And if they had released it earlier, it might have helped Trump, even if it was even if it was just marginally. And if they held this back, that's sick. That's not good, because how many other men would have come under this guy's pressure since then? All of those questions come to my mind.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, because if nothing else, let's say nothing else happened other than taking a news cycle, meaning Lincoln Project gets marred by, this particular event. So instead of the videos and everything else that these guys are putting out, this becomes the news. Yeah, I agree with you, Shane. That's an interesting question. When did they know it? The only person charged in the Justice Department's investigation into the origins of the probe of former President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and its ties to Russia was spared prison time for altering an email used to support surveillance applications. Former FBI attorney Kevin Kleinsmith, 38, received the sentence of 12 months probation and 400 hours community service from the United States District Court Judge James Bogsberg Friday. During a video hearing, Kleinsmith is responsible for editing emails too. Now, this is what we were talking about over the weekend, I think, also. This is horrible. Like, to put this in perspective, he altered an email to support the surveillance application, and they knew at this point that they weren't being honest on this stuff. And unfortunately, he gets basically probation. How do you get probation on this? That's astonishing. Shane, are we going to get Kariakou on today to talk about this?
We're still damn well trying. We're pushing for somebody, and I'm pretty sure we'll be able to get him, because this is big news. This is the only charge so far that's come out of John Durham's probe into the origins of the Mueller report. And the fact that he doesn't get put in jail after the Department of Justice recommended it, the fact that he gets probation and 400 hours of community service, that's not enough, man. More charges should have been filed. And this one charge that has been filed, the dude should be facing jail time for not only ruining a guy's life, for screwing with Carter Page himself, but for lying to a lot of people. It's not just the people who are on that email chain that he edited. It's the entire mass of the American public, which, as a result of what he did for months, was blaming a dude and supporting a false theory. So yeah, it's a huge crime. It might seem small, but its significance, the consequences are massive.
No, this is not small at all. I mean, because he's basically changing information to get a case. That's horrible. Like, to put this in perspective, 99.7% of FISA warrants are approved. Now, you don't have a defense attorney with you there. The lawyer or whoever's talking and making this argument has to disclose everything that they know. And to put it mildly, changing evidence on somebody, oh man, that is horrendous. Yeah, he should have been thrown in jail over that one. The idea he's getting probation is horrendous. Not to mention, it incentivizes the behavior on some level to let this guy off the probation. But we can end this here. Let's stop it here. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
What do we want?
News, politics, and culture.
When do we want it?
Wait, we weren't finished. News, politics, and culture without the red and blue spin.
Okay, so now when do you want it?
Daily from noon to 2 p.m. Eastern Time.
Okay, satisfied now?
Never. Tune into Political Misfits on 105.5 FM in Washington, D.C. and on 102.9 and 104.7 FM in Kansas City, Missouri. Daily for our analytical fix. Don't surrender.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and Shane Stranahan. And we are now joined by Netfa Freeman, policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies, member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, and a radio talk show host and producer. Netfa, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I'm good. Thank you for having me back.
Thank you for being with us. All right. Today is the first day of Black History Month. We're going to have a wide-ranging conversation here, not just talking about history, but what's going on in the present, what we see coming in the future. But I'll just hand it over to you. Give us your first thoughts on this one. What should we think? What should we be thinking about today to sort of set this month in the right direction, Netfa?
Well, I guess you mean in terms of Black History Month. Well, that's interesting. I think like Black History Month, like a lot of things that have to do with more grassroots and considerations of the people. This country, which is with its tendency to be capitalist and imperialist and capitalist and white supremacist and patriarchal, has a tendency to sanitize things like Black History Month. From their origins, which are meant to kind of uplift oppressed people, things like Black History Month, and also commercialize them because it's, a capitalist country. It tends to want to make money off of everything. And so now we see Black History Month in its most sanitized version, where you'll see a bunch of companies that will be using it to promote products and commodify things and sell things. And then you'll also see, even Hollywood or whatever, TV stations, different things, giving us the most superficial considerations around Black History Month. Like, the same leaders, Harriet Tubman, maybe Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King, but not really giving us the essence of what those people stood for, not really giving us an insights into their philosophies about life and struggle against oppression, not really giving us insights about the historical context that they struggled, and definitely not talking about the things today that would stand in stark contradiction to what they lived up to. So a lot of times their honoring of people will be very superficial and hypocritical. Like, for example, one example is Dr. King was against imperialism and militarism. But this country stands, as Dr. King himself said, as the biggest purveyor of violence in the world. And so you have a lot of leaders who actually, at the time, some of them at the time, and even their ilk, stood opposed to Dr. King toward the latter years of his life when he took a stand against the Vietnam War and started talking against imperialism. But yet now, those same people, or even people of their ilk, let's say, I would refer to it as the black petty bourgeoisie, even others, let's say Biden, Kamala Harris, who would honor Dr. King and feign ownership of him without making sure we don't really know the essence of these principled stands that Dr. King took. So that's just one example of Dr. King, but there's a whole host of examples like this.
It's like the commodification of racial strife. It's so very strange. Kaepernick and Nike was a good example, where Kaepernick takes a knee. He does it because they're shooting and killing blacks in the street. He loses the ability to work, and then Nike comes out with the shoe, and Nike makes buku bucks. And honestly, it's not that I have an issue with Kaepernick doing it per se. I'm more so pointing out that it's an odd commodification when you think about the basis of it and what they're using to make profit on. And so that's very strange. From your standpoint, what should we be talking about during Black history? Because, like you said, they tend to undermine what the people actually believe. So Martin Luther King, for example, the Vietnam War. Well, that doesn't stop Democrats from bombing everything in sight, nor does it stop them from trying to undermine certain programs or attacking the left. Martin Luther King was a socialist. He believed in this kind of, not to mention being thrown in jail for rights and everything else. They entirely decapitate that part. And so this, to some degree, goes down the line. What should people be studying for this month? Or just in general? I'm not going to confine it to a month, but you know what I mean. What should people, if they really wanted to get into this kind of essence of Black political thought, what would be the thing that these guys get involved in? What would they study? Or what should they be thinking of?
That's a good question. There's so many things to study. Maybe I would start with, and I think it might be fitting to start with the history. Everything has a history. We have to think of things that way. So there's always the origin of things and how they evolved and developed. So why not start with Negro History Week, which is as it was originally created by Carter G. Woodson in 1926, and then evolved, and then study its evolution. Also, one thing about history is also taught to us in a very stagnant and static way, as if it's just a chronology of events and personalities to memorize and know about without it actually looking at what is the methodology of history as a mode of understanding the world today, right now. So in other words, looking at the evolution of Negro History Week all the way to Black History Week and then Black History Month, and then what was taking place in the world at the various times and even between that time until now to cause or to account for that evolution. At the same time, also, what is history as an evolutionary, as an unfolding and developing concept of things that help us understand the prevailing conditions of our time. For example, it doesn't have to be all dire, but I think one thing about Negro History Week at the time, we could think of Carter G. Woodson being, his purview predominantly being Africans, and I say Africans meaning Black people anywhere in the world, predominantly being in the U.S. But then since that time, we should be able to see and account for interconnections and interrelationships, movements connecting with each other across borders, and broadening our definition of ourselves to what I would say is the Pan-African world. And so we should be able to look and see. So you have Carter G. Woodson, also at the same time Marcus Garvey, who was someone who looked at the African world. And then how does it answer questions like, for example, we have our young people and other people, there's our communities are plagued with violence and poverty, intercommunal violence. Sometimes we even have weapons in our, on the continent of Africa, but also here in the urban cities of the United States. But that should not, if we understand our history, that's not characteristic of us from our origins, even in Africa or anywhere else, in terms of this type of dire intercommunal conflict and the oppressions that we face. So if our study of history doesn't answer how we got from one condition to now, and even answer questions like how are we identifying only as African Americans, some would say, but not taking and saying, well, we're descendants of slaves. Well, who determined that? How did that get determined? We can't just be descendants of slaves if we know we came from a continent prior to that. And there's a transatlantic slave trade. There was conditions and civilizations and a history on the continent of Africa, which we're never told. So how do we broaden our purview about what we study and use it and apply it in such a way that it helps us answer the conditions and the problems that we face today?
What is wrong with considering oneself a descendant of a slave? I don't see anything wrong with it. Well, what's from your standpoint, what's the issue?
Right, because it's actually doing what the enslavers have done. It's severing our history at the Middle Passage. When it's saying there's nothing worth considering or understanding about ourselves before we were brought here in chains to the Americas from the continent of Africa. It's not acknowledging that. And at the same time, it's not even just about the history. At the same time, we have movements since then. I mean, even during the 60s or, that were even before the 60s or the African Congresses in 1900s, they were making connections with our people across the Atlantic, in the continent of Africa, the Western Hemisphere, throughout the Western Hemisphere. And so if those connections and those movements that were pivotal, that had some impact on how we, were challenging the prevailing oppressive, forces of our time, if they're not understood or studied, then, and there's reasons why the oppressor obviously wouldn't want that. It's not beneficial.
Who specifically are you talking about here?
I'll be honest. So the ruling, whatever. So, okay. So if it's not like we should get caught up in a who, like a person or a group, but there are people who benefit from the status quo. There's a ruling class. There's this in this country. It's founded on white supremacy, capitalism, and patriarchy. That's how it develops. And there's people who benefit from that. So anyone who benefits from that.
I'm talking about who would you recommend reading? Like who you're talking about? You're talking about the reading the voices and the views of underrepresented people or people whose opinions have not historically been portrayed. Who are you talking about? Like, can you give us some names or some text or some leads on that one?
Oh, I see. So Walter Rodney he wrote a book, and so I can give you also some books. How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. W.E.B. Du Bois. A lot of these are figures that we might have heard of, but don't really know a lot about. Carter G. Woodson himself, The Miseducation of the Negro. Kwame Nkrumah, who was in Ghana and wrote a whole number of things related to the liberation of our people and around the world. Claudia Jones, if we want to talk to, who was a revolutionary originally from the Caribbean and then moved to London and was active here in the United States. The history of Ella Baker, the history of Assata Shakur, who's living in exile in Cuba right now, was in the 60s and the 70s with part of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. These are, like individuals who have writings. And Dr. King, a lot of people don't read like Dr. King's book, Where Do We Go From Here? People will say, I know Dr. King, I appreciate Dr. King and love him. But if you ask the same group of people, like people have done it, and the raised hands would go up. How many of you read his book, Where Do We Go From Here? The hands to go down. And so these are things. So in other words, we're taught in a very static way to appreciate, but on a superficial level, various events in history and in personalities in history, but not really taught how to dig deeper and glean the most relevant lessons from their examples.
Let's take a break because we only have maybe a minute with left in a segment. But we're going to bring you back. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Nefta Freeman, policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies, member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, and a radio show host and producer. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling...
He's not coming back.
Great shot. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Quick heads up, by the way, we are on the radio, 105.5 FM and 1390 AM in D.C., Washington, D.C. We are also on in Kansas City, 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM in Kansas City. If you're digging what Jamarl and I are putting down, please give up a like and share this video. And if you want to join the conversation, you can. 202-521-1320 is the number. Again, that's 202-521-1320. We continue to be joined by our guest, Netfa Freeman, policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies, member of the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace, and a radio talk show host and producer. Netfa, thank you for sticking with us. I want to talk about Nobel Prize nominations. Jared Kushner, the former president's son-in-law, this is the son-in-law of Donald Trump, husband of Ivanka Trump, has become the nominee for a Nobel Peace Prize, this at the recommendation of Alan Dershowitz. Meanwhile, a Norwegian politician has nominated the Black Lives Matter movement for that same prize, and he has very quickly received death threats. I'm gonna put it like this. I have my problems with some of the stuff that was going on last summer. I'm not saying that all of that was Black Lives Matter movement. I've got my problems with that. And yet, even with all that included, even with all that on the table, I would say if I had to compare the two, BLM deserves a Nobel Peace Prize way more than Jared Kushner. Now, of course, he's being considered for this because of his role in bringing together different nations in the Middle East, basically reconciling Israel specifically with a number of its near neighbors. That's definitely a major diplomatic coup for the United States and for Israel and for Jared Kushner. But I'm not sure what that actually does in the long run. If at the same time you're perpetuating a lot of the problems with Israel, if you're making it so that the Palestinians who live there, continue to have to live under that regime. Anyway, this at the same time, of course, as the Norwegian who recommended BLM for that slot has received death threats. I'm going to turn it to you, Netfa. What do you think about this? What is this indicative of for you?
This is a lot. How much time we got? No, well, I don't know where to start with this. So obviously this is this shows also I don't know how much what the Nobel Peace Prize can really mean at this point. I mean, Obama got awarded the Nobel Peace Prize too, and every president of the United States is pretty much has done something to qualify as a war criminal. So I don't know how. We have to face it. So it's easy to dislike Trump with his naked sexism and racism and his connections and his winks, nods to that kind of stuff. But at the same time, the more covert and more friendly face of U.S. imperialism and white supremacy and patriarchy is also no less than those kind of things. It just, so Barack Obama represents warmongering and even white supremacy just as much as any other president can be. So that, in that sense, it almost makes the Nobel Peace Prize, kind of dilutes its significance. So BLM, I guess it's, I would say, well, one, it's more of a movement. There are organizations, the Black Lives Matter movement organization that tries to oversee and preside over it all. I don't know how much we can attribute what's been going on in the valiant stand of the grassroots masses to that group. And I think that, if you were able to give a whole group in this generation of young people that I would also say are not just Black, but just all of them who stood up against the injustices or the repressive apparatus of this system, I think they all deserve the Nobel Peace Prize, or just a prize just to stand up against oppression, if not that prize. I don't really I don't really know if I would have any comments about Kushner. I mean, clearly, this question of what's happening in the Middle East is an affront to the self-determination rights of Palestinian people. And so to see that as some sort of progress or some sort of bringing together forces that preside over and stand in stark opposition to the rights and the human rights of Palestinian people. So that shouldn't be something that's even honored. And so that all of this is just a lot of hypocrisy and a lot of hypocrisy and I don't know, superficial window dressing for things.
That's an understatement. If you're gonna we're gonna give this guy a Nobel Peace Prize representing an apartheid state, and we're also going to put Black Lives Matter up for it. Yeah, and I do think it's telling that BLM gets the hate mail, or the Norwegian person who put it up gets the flack for it. From your standpoint, do you think that there have been, would you say that the changes were substantial and are entrenched? Meaning, after the Black Lives Matter protests were taking place earlier in the year, we had this kind of perspective shift within the context of the country. Do you think that's long lasting? Do you think that ran deeper than what it may seem on somewhat of a shallow level? Or do you think, no, this country was a racist country from the beginning, it hasn't necessarily changed, it's still unrepentant in that? How do you see it? I mean, because the question was always during the protests, is it going to last? Or is the perspectives and the feelings that are taking place going to last? And to be honest, even going back, looking at it from here, what are your perspective of everything that took place over the last year?
Mm-hmm. So I think that what we're seeing right now is a global crisis, but also playing out in various ways within the United States. It's a crisis, one of the legitimacy of any what's considered the leadership, the people in power and governments and the elected officials. It's suffering a serious crisis of legitimacy that's on a couple sides, and particularly what we're seeing, even the rise of this naked, what we call naked racist, sexist element that the people that stormed the Capitol, they are against or having problems with the government for one reason or for one interpretation of the crisis. And then the rest of us are having it for a different reason. For example, it's just not this pandemic has exposed the inadequacy of this system, rather the capitalist system, to address the fundamental needs of people, particularly those who are non-white and working class. And then the response of the rulers, the response of those who benefit from this system, neoliberal capitalism, is only repression. It doesn't matter who's in president. All they can do is, and so we've seen this stark difference in responses when they roll out the National Guard and everything for people who are protesting against real repression, physical repression against them by agents of the state. And people weren't even coming to storm the Capitol. They were in their own, we're in our own communities marching through, and then they roll in the National Guard and militarized troops. And then the response to the people who stormed the Capitol, were they able to even penetrate inside the Capitol. So this is indicative of a double standard that they will want us to believe. Those who are more now have the reins of power want us to believe that it's only about Trump and it's only about the more naked racists and whatnot. But at the same time, we can see in this, these same people have no interest in implementing the type of policies that would get the pandemic in order, that would mitigate the economic crisis that people are facing that was on its way before the pandemic, universal health care, guaranteed incomes, even nationalizing certain big companies that are really doing a job in terms of oppressing their workers. There's a whole number of things, erasing debt, the student debt, and even we really should have universal education as well. These things would solve the problems, but they're also too antithetical to capitalism. And then also being able to really look at the foreign policies, which are interconnected rather, with the domestic policy.
Nefa, here's where I would take this one. I mean, I agree a lot. Those policies would get a lot of public support, no matter your race, no matter what demographic you're a part of. They would get a lot of support from people in the country. Race, which admittedly is a historic and a continuing problem in the United States, institutionally, as far as I can tell, a lot, like, I'll put it like this. You drew the parallel between the Black Lives Matter protests last summer and what happened with the Capitol raid on January 6th. Now, admittedly, the National Guard and police across the nation responded much more strongly over the summer than they did on January 6th. On the other hand, since January 6th, white supremacist has become the kind of byword for a lot of the folks who were engaged in that riot. I didn't see that. What I saw was a lot of people who were hoodwinked by Donald Trump and who were deeply frustrated with where they saw the country going, not just in some sort of anachronistic American sense, but specifically under lockdown this year and last year, dealing with the economy. I saw a lot of people frustrated about what was going on, and they were looking to Trump for an answer, and he betrayed them just literally the next day. Here's where I'm going with this. I don't see how labeling them, I guess I'll put it like this. White supremacy exists on an institutional level, but it doesn't seem to be a useful rallying cry for the working class. It seems like it has continued to divide members of the working class for years, if not decades at this point, along racial lines. And it seems to be an effective divide and conquer strategy to keep poor people from mobilizing together by basically making them blame each other for, you can impute some moral guilt here, but it seems to only be in the interest of the establishment. What's your take on that, Nefa?
I agree with that. I mean, it's absolutely correct. And so it's a result. It only is successful because there is not a sufficient level of political education and understanding of the dynamics and the intersections between these forms of oppression, classism, racism, and sexism, or white supremacy, patriarchy, and capitalism. And so we don't, this country can't afford, particularly now on the level of leadership, even the most, even Donald Trump would say, I'm not a racist. Everyone wants to, say they're not a sexist, they're not a racist, but they will not denounce capitalism. So I always say with somewhat of a pun and maybe intended, capitalism trumps white supremacy and patriarchy. So they'll do the superficial things like have a black president, have now a black woman vice president to placate the people, which are really in some ways antithetical to a racist tendency and those kind of tendencies and principle or characteristics of this country. But it's all to preserve the ultimate oppressive system of capitalism. And so, and I think that there's the media and the education we get and all that has to be countered, or some kind of alternative has to be developed and emerge from the masses of the people that will give us an understanding of these dynamics that we face, and also embed them in a organizational movement that can challenge the rulers.
We only have about a minute per se, a minute left or so. From your standpoint, what do you think is going to take place in? Well, let's back up on that for a moment. You mentioned earlier, there's something that you said earlier that I want to hit to before we close, has to do with the American descendants of slaves. The descendants of slaves. Your Pan-Africanism basically runs in conflict with us. I mean, in the way that it's being described, or in the way that I've seen people argue this very specific point. Why would you make the argument for Pan-African as opposed to American descendants of slave or African descendants of slave? Because you made your point yourself, where it seems like, well, you didn't make the point, but I'll make the point. It seems like there was a demarcation point at that point. And because of that, it seems like it was something fundamentally different on the other side of it. So why would you make the case for Pan-Africanism as opposed to something like the American descendants of slaves?
Well, because it's consistent with a materialist interpretation or understanding of not just of history, but of where we're going. So we all are interconnected. We suffer the same system against the same system and suffer the same conditions of our counterparts in other countries, in Venezuela, in Nigeria, wherever we are. we are connected, the same system. And so also, so if we're looking at our origins as being in Africa, and that which can't be disputed, it doesn't, a materialist understanding of that examination of that origin would just say, well, we're really Africans with the extension and a diversified and extended connections and history. And so it doesn't, and one, it's also if in fact there is strength in unity, that it makes sense for us to unite, which is also why we do it, because that's what's happened over the time, is that we've united and tried to attempt to unite with our people, our family in other parts of the world. And so to only identify, and it has a tendency to do that, to want people who are identifying as American descendants of slaves, to discount and in some forms have even rejected immigration and other people, and saying we have no connection when it's not true. We have connections, not just connections where we work together, but actually in condition. And so it's an effort to, and only serves the purpose of those who benefit from our oppression, to isolate ourselves and disconnect ourselves from the network of our extensions around the world.
Excellent. The voice that you guys were listening to is policy analyst with the Institute for Policy Studies, member of the Coordinating Committee of Black Alliance for Peace, and radio talk show host and producer, Netfa Freeman. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Tranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and our guest, John Kiriakou. He's a former CIA officer. He's the co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and he's an author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. And by the way, you can follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou and check his work out. Learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. John, thank you for joining us. We're seeing a lot of each other these days. How are you doing this morning?
We are. Happy to do it. I'm doing well. How are you?
Good. Better for having you with us. Thanks for joining. Let's talk about Kevin Kleinsmith. This is the only charge from John Durham's investigation, into quote-unquote investigation into the origins of the Mueller report. His probe has unearthed just this so far in terms of actual legal culpability. And then the dude gets off effectively scot-free. He doesn't get put in jail. He gets probation and some community work. This despite lying on a massive scale to the American public, misleading the American public to believe that Carter Page was a Russian asset when in fact he was a CIA asset. What's your take on these events?
Yeah,
John?
This is there's so much to say here. First of all, let's talk about John Durham. The Durham report was eagerly awaited by a lot of people for a long time, and it's just turned out to be a bust. The media led us to believe that Attorney Durham was going to eventually indict John Brennan and any number of other former CIA leaders for their role in what was effectively a spying operation against the Trump campaign. None of that ever happened. And then at the end of the day, the only charges, as you just said, were against this low-level FBI person, Kevin Kleinsmith. He probably should have gotten at least a few months in prison. The federal sentencing guidelines called for 0 to 6 months in prison, and the prosecution asked for at least some time because George Papadopoulos, who had done even less than Kleinsmith, got 2 weeks in prison, and Kleinsmith got off with a slap in the hand. Now, what Kleinsmith had done was to falsify an FBI email, as you said, Shane, to indicate that Carter Page was a Russian asset. Carter Page was not a Russian asset. He was a CIA asset, reporting back to the CIA about the Russians. So, everything was wrong here from the very beginning. And in the end, nobody's going to pay any price.
John, welcome to the show, John. I always enjoy it when you come on.
Hi, Jamarl.
This seems like it would be worse than 6 months, though. I mean, basically, we're talking about a shadowy process. What dude is...
Yes.
Because we have to trust, on some level, that if somebody is investigating something, either us or somebody else, and if it was us, we would want honesty in that investigation, and to have somebody basically fraud on this kind of mass scale to go after Page, it seems like the consequences will be far more than just 6 months. It seems like this would be a big, much bigger deal.
There's kind of a joke in this community, in these circles, that whenever prosecutors go before a judge at sentencing time, they talk about how grave the crime was, and they always use the term grave, even when these crimes are not grave. When Mike Flynn was sentenced, they said that his crime was very grave. Well, all he did was he lied to an FBI agent, like once. That was it. So it really wasn't grave. But in my view, this actually was grave, at least in the greater scheme of the investigation. This was essentially a setup where he was accusing an American citizen of treason. He was accusing an American citizen of committing espionage against the United States. And it wasn't true. I mean, this is the stuff that ruins people's lives forever. And he's really not going to pay a price for that.
It's bizarre. You know what you mentioned, Brennan? Let's do a brief review. Who else do you think deserves some charges here? Who is involved in the Mueller probe? I know that a lot of people have been talking about Peter Strzok, Lisa Page for a long time. If you had to put together a short list, who should have faced, at least the penalty of being put in jail?
Well, number one has to be Peter Strzok. Right? Peter Strzok believed that he was going to go to jail because the first thing he did when he was fired by the FBI was to create a legal defense fund that raised well over $250,000. So I think Peter Strzok should have been first in line to go to prison, or at least to be charged. Lisa Page was another one, although I think based on the evidence that we've seen, her guilt was less than her boyfriend, Peter Strzok. But to tell you the truth, besides John Brennan, I would look at Gina Haspel. Because Gina Haspel, we need to know what role Gina Haspel had in the decision to collect information on the Trump campaign. The CIA is not allowed to collect information on American citizens. It is not allowed to conduct operations on U.S. soil. And that's exactly what they did. And nobody's ever explained why or who approved it, what the result was, or most importantly, why no one was prosecuted.
Basically, I guess in the final analysis, Barr showed a little bit of leg, as if he was gonna push through some kind of investigation into this, bringing on Durham. Mm-hmm. And basically, this was a dog and pony show. Like, am I wrong in that impression? Like that basically he knew Trump wanted to go after, look into the Russiagate stuff. And in looking into it, Barr, who seemed to be lining up with Trump on many of the policies, especially when he first got in, seemed to go through with that. And like you said, I was waiting for this report with bated breath. But it seems like he just kind of a dog and pony show. I mean, was it one of those things where Barr was just a member of the machine of sorts? And as a member of the machine, basically gave Trump just what he needed so Trump would leave him to his devices, as they basically did nothing in this case? Is that the way this is? Like he was a company man? What?
I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that analysis is right on. Yes, I think that's exactly what happened. You can even compare this grander investigation in a way to Watergate. And what I mean is not in the seriousness of this versus the seriousness of Watergate. Watergate, of course, brought down a president. But if you look at some of the sentences, or most of the sentences at Watergate, as grave as those crimes were, and I used the word grave just now, the sentences were 2 months, 6 months, 8 months, The burglars were in and out before you knew it. They all went to minimum security camps. No big deal. And that's what we're seeing here. So I think your analysis, Jamarl, is right on. I think that Barr needed to show a little leg, as you said. He needed to convince Trump that something was being done about these bad Democrats at the FBI who were trying to frame the president. And it's done. And now everybody can move on.
And that sets the historical precedent too. I mean, it's not just about guilt and due time for those who are responsible for committing crimes. It's also about setting the sort of journalistic standard of where this story is seen, in perpetuity by future journalism, by the news media going on, by the legal system in general. In other words, if you've got a completely unfounded investigation, and it's known to be unfounded in many cases by the people who are setting it up, and there's evidence of this, clear evidence of this that comes out, and yet nobody faces time for it. There's one person who gets charged, and he basically gets a hall pass. Then that means that the story, as sort of reviewed briefly, as summarized by people in the future, will be, well, not that much actually happened. What's your take on that, John?
I think you are absolutely right. There's a famous statement by former Attorney General Robert Jackson that every law student learns, and it's from a speech that he gave in 1940, in which he talks about prosecutors, and he says here, and I actually just pulled it up. The prosecutor's discretion is tremendous. He can have citizens investigated, and if he is that kind of person, he can have this done to the tune of public statements and veiled or unveiled intimations. Or the prosecutor may choose a more subtle course and simply have a citizen's friends interviewed. The prosecutor can order arrests, present cases to the grand jury in secret session, and on the basis of his one-sided presentation of the facts can cause the citizen to be indicted and held for trial. He can dismiss the case before trial, et cetera, et cetera. The point here is that prosecutors can do anything they want to anyone they want. And in this case, they didn't want to do anything. They wanted to pretend that they were doing something. They wanted to show the president that they were on top of the story. And then in the end, they really weren't. They really didn't want to pursue this.
That's unfortunate. I mean, because honestly, the country needed to know what happened.
Absolutely.
We were raptured in a conspiracy theory for 3 years. And now it's like, there's nothing to see here. Let's just move on. Are you serious? How do you do that? And I love the point that you made about prosecutors, especially in the case of FISA warrants, where these guys don't have a defense attorney there standing beside them.
No, they don't even know they're under investigation.
Exactly. To talk about that for the moment, and we have about 30 seconds to a minute, because you made a point about the power of prosecutors. The power of prosecutors is amazing. I mean, most of the policies, or most of the verdicts, or the things that these guys come to agreements with, are basically agreements with prosecutors. Like a lot of these things, they don't go to court.
Yeah, in the case of a FISA warrant, you don't have any idea that you are being investigated. You don't have any idea that they are considering crimes against you. You don't have any opportunity to defend yourself in court, to make an argument as to why you shouldn't be under federal surveillance. It's secret surveillance. And then that FISA warrant can be renewed every 90 days. And every 90 days, you still don't have any idea you're being investigated. You still don't have any right to defend yourself. It's really un-American as far as I'm concerned.
And that is what was happening to Carter Page. I mean, they kept bringing it over and
they
over
renewed
and over
it three
again.
times on Carter Page.
Yeah.
Three times that warrant was renewed.
Even when they knew that he was an asset. That's why I say this is a massive deal. Or this story is a big, big deal. Our intelligence services is like, do we really want to create an incentive for, it's a slap on the wrist to basically set somebody up? And I would say, well, no, we don't. I think this is a horrible precedent.
It's un-American.
John, I want to thank you for coming on, man. John Kiriakou is a former CIA officer, co-host of The Backstory on Radio Sputnik, and author of books including The CIA Insider's Guide to the Iran Crisis and The Reluctant Spy. You guys can follow John on Twitter at John Kiriakou and learn more about him at johnkiriakou.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines. We can go to early break. We have about roughly a minute left. Shane, this particular conversation with the with Carter Page stuff, and basically the is it just me? But this should be far more serious.
It is serious. Yeah, Carter Page was all over the headlines for a while there, for many months, if not, over a year. I'd have to go back and check it out. But he was for a time a massive public figure, and of course he was a political figure. And like John was saying, this is the kind of thing that does a career in. And while the record has been corrected by those who are paying attention, it hasn't been corrected by public opinion. And if he chooses to work with people, he's going to have a hard time in a lot of cases going forward, simply because whoever he chooses to work with risks the backlash of having worked with this dude. So again, a big deal for him and a big deal for the record too. We've got to go into a break. You guys have been listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in just a minute with headlines.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live for our last hour, coming to you from across the divided states of America. It is now time for the last hour of today's show, the most disruptive show in American and global news and politics. In the politically independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, we're going into the news here. First up in COVID news, at least 1,875 new coronavirus deaths and 111,364 new cases were reported in the U.S. on January 31st. That's yesterday. Over the past week, there has been an average of 148,444 cases per day, a decrease of 32% from the average 2 weeks earlier. As of Monday morning, more than 26,216,600 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 441,000 have died from it. I'm gonna make another quick note here. I'm hoping that this, the 32% decrease in infections that we were just talking about here, I hope that as it did last week, that trend continues through this week. If we can get that decrease up to 32, 33%, even higher, it's not like we have control over it, but still, if that happens, then what you get is, a sort of exponential decrease over time. If it keeps getting a third as every week goes by, then, well, not only are the infections going to drop, but of course, the death rate is going to drop. The ICU occupancy is going to drop. And that means that, more people getting better treatment, getting less sick is a good thing for Americans. And ideally, that means, in the long run, we can start to benefit other countries too. For all the talk of vaccine nationalism earlier on, we were talking about this earlier on with Peter Oliver at about 7:45 this morning, 7:45 Eastern. I hope that we can be of benefit to the world. Admittedly, we have had our problems, but there's still a chance that later on this year, other countries that need it, particularly developing nations, and I'm including the EU, I guess, in that count for some reason, that we can be of some assistance to them. But hey, here's to hoping. We'll see. The Federal Emergency Management Agency is now supporting vaccination efforts in Arizona, Illinois, Kentucky, Maryland, Nevada, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Texas, Virginia, West Virginia, and Washington State after President Joe Biden ordered the government to get on a war footing in his mission to vaccinate 300 million Americans by summer's end. The agency, which has budgeted $1.2 billion for its COVID-19 mission, said it will reimburse states that deploy their National Guard troops to assist at vaccination sites. That, I'll be honest, I don't like what we saw at the Capitol building over the inauguration. I don't like the militarization of the Capitol, but you use the military in some of these emergencies when you need them. We were talking about this early last year, both on the previous incarnation of Fault Lines and on, I believe, our version of Fault Lines, using the military in some of these cases. Hey, if you got them, this is where you use them. Anyway, yesterday, I'm not saying that FEMA, anyway, I was saying that they're a particularly bellicose organization. Yesterday, Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot and Chicago Public Schools CEO Dr. Janice Jackson insisted that teachers return to the classroom today amid the heated situation between Chicago Public Schools and the union representing thousands of educators over the debate of resuming in-person learning amid the coronavirus pandemic. For nearly an hour Saturday, about 50 vaccination opponents and right-wing supporters of former President Donald Trump delayed COVID-19 vaccinations when they protested at the entrance to Dodger Stadium as the site of a mass vaccination campaign. They held signs that said things such as COVID equals scam, don't be a lab rat, and tell Bill Gates to go vaccinate himself, quote, end quote. I'm not sure that I'm pretty sure he's down for that. The protesters caused the Los Angeles Fire Department to close the stadium entrance as a precaution. Just on Bill Gates for a second. Last I checked, literally the last public opinion poll that was taken on this stuff, it was basically a review of the popularity of various public figures. And I was having a hard time pinpointing a date on when this was taken, so who knows, could have changed significantly since then. But Bill Gates was like the second most liked public figure of those reviewed. It was like a 72% approval rate and like a 20% disapproval rate or something. And I think this was a while ago, this was years ago. But it's just interesting to me. I wonder how much that's changed over the course of the year, because there have certainly been a lot of prominent, or at least vocal, Bill Gates skeptics. But overall, I think most people are still okay with the dude. What's your take on this, Jamarl? And coming back to the Dodger Stadium blockage there, I don't think that's a good look for the people who are doing the blockade. I think that's the biggest public takeaway from this is you guys load this up. Who knows how many people are going to get sick because they weren't able to get those vaccines, or their access to them was slowed down. What's your take on that?
I think it's horrendous. I mean, like, this story is mind-blowing. I mean, when you think about it, it's like, because not only are they saying it's a hoax, it's like, it's a hoax, it's a scam, you shouldn't believe it. Meaning, it's one thing if you believe that. Like, if you have that thought in your head, if you're sitting somewhere and you believe that, fair enough. God bless. I have nothing to do with you and your beliefs on that front. But the moment that you grab a sign and say that not only do I not believe in this, I don't want you to get it either. That's ridiculous. Like what do they? I mean, I'm just obscene. It's like we don't believe in the virus, and so we don't believe you should get a vaccine, and the vaccine is harmful. It's like, so wait, all of it? Like, across the board, they're just against doing anything about it. And that's obscene. I find that to be massively obscene. We have 440,000 deaths. Put that in perspective, right? And even if somebody want to say, hey, you can use these other drugs in order to minimize it and everything else, that's great, but this gets to the question of whether or not people should be able to blockade other people from getting medical treatments. And of course, I'm going to be against that. This is, ridiculous, to put it mildly.
It is. You know what? We could talk more about this for a while, but we've got a lot more headlines to go through. So I'm going to get into them. 10 Republican senators on Sunday announced their own plan. They unveiled a roughly $600 billion COVID-19 relief package. That's a counter proposal to President Biden's $1.9 trillion plan. Under a third of the size in terms of the financial outlay there. The lawmakers, including Senators Susan Collins of Maine, Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, Mitt Romney of Utah, and Rob Portman of Ohio, told Biden in a letter that they devised the plan, quote, in the spirit of bipartisanship and unity, end quote. The president has urged and said that they plan to release a full proposal today. The counterproposal includes a total of $160 billion for vaccine development and distribution, testing and tracing, and treatment and supplies, including the production and deployment of personal protective equipment. It also includes a new round of direct payments for, quote, families who need assistance the most, end quote. It extends enhanced federal unemployment benefits at the current level and provides $4 billion to bolster behavioral health and substance abuse. Louisiana Senator Bill Cassidy, one of the Republicans who signed on to the letter, said the GOP plan includes payments starting at $1,000. That's lower than the $1,400 Biden's plan provides for, which would decrease depending on an individual's income level. Today, President Joe Biden will meet with the Republican senators who have drawn up the counterproposal to his plan. The senators said in a joint statement Sunday that they appreciated Biden's quick response to their proposal and had accepted an invitation to meet the president at the White House on Monday afternoon. I'm curious, Jamarl. Let's just pause on this for a moment. Say this works. Say they come together, they come to some compromise. Maybe it's not $600 billion. Maybe it's not $1.9 trillion. Maybe it's like $1 trillion. So it's closer to theirs, in some counts, and they get this out relatively quickly. Now, that seems like a pipe dream at this point, even though, many, including you, I'm sure, would say that wouldn't be enough. But still, the idea that politicians could actually come to a compromise and agree on something and get it done expeditiously doesn't seem likely. But say that happens. What precedent does that set for Biden's administration? Or are you just not going to accept the possibility? Jamarl?
Well, it's not. I think Republicans would negotiate with Joe Biden if Joe Biden just capitulated. So, I think negotiation is possible, or bipartisanship is possible, if one side just gives in. But in this very specific case, they could say, hey, we found $800 billion, we're good. They could say that. I think the honest question, though, is it adequate? Is $800 billion adequate? Or is $1 trillion adequate? What do you need the money to do? I think it's far more of an important question, as opposed to whether these guys would get together. Because honestly, they don't really need Republican help at this point to push through their agenda. And I still say, if Biden bites this apple, and it is inadequate to basically provide the things that people need, be it rent, be it evictions, whatever, he's going to get punished for that. I think look at how Obama lost House, Senate, eventually the presidency. And I think the same thing would happen to Joe Biden if Joe Biden didn't necessarily try to knock this out of the park and deal with real people's needs, especially after that campaign against Trump. So like I said, I'm not against the idea of them compromising, but the question is, are the Republicans going to be okay for $15 an hour minimum wage? And is Biden going to be okay with knocking that down to, let's say, 9 or 10 in order to get over the finish line? Those are the questions that come in. And honestly, Biden is one of those guys who might worship bipartisanship for the sake of it. So it's unclear to me. I think they would take advantage of him if he's willing to do that. So my thought is you shouldn't do it. But it's possible, Shane. It depends.
It's possible. We'll see. We'll cross that bridge if we get there. Just wanted to pose it. We got more news. In national news, Trump's impeachment team has lost at least 3 of its lawyers after the former president reportedly asked them to focus on claims of voter fraud as part of his defense strategy. He's also lost the whole team. All 5 lawyers on his defense team dropped, by the way. Trump advisor Jason Miller said the former president did not ask the lawyers to do so, and any suggestion otherwise was quote-unquote fake news. 2 new attorneys, David Schoen and Bruce Castor Jr., were named Sunday evening. This is just days before a pretrial brief is due for the impeachment trial that is set to begin a week next Tuesday, so a week from tomorrow. A vote in the Senate last week showed that 45 Republicans believe impeaching a former president is unconstitutional. We're going to be talking a lot more about this, of course, over this week, as well as next week as the actual trial commences. 21 men have accused John Weaver, the co-founder of Lincoln Project, of online harassment, including sexual harassment of young men in relationships that appeared to have lasted years, starting with underage teenage boys and escalating to direct sexual requests after those boys reached the age of maturity. The Lincoln Project is the largest new anti-Trump organization on the right wing. And I would say, I don't want to repeat myself too often here, but I wonder how long they knew this information. I wonder for how long they had information that this guy was doing this, and then they selectively waited until after Trump lost the election, Biden won it, and Biden was in the White House finally to release this, just because the Lincoln Project, again, a prominent anti-Trump organization, Never Trumpers, the largest right-wing Never Trumper organization, especially a new one. So I'm curious about that, because if they sat on that, then who knows how many more kids were at risk? Who knows how many more boys were being groomed, basically. The only person charged, we were talking about this earlier with John Kiriakou just a couple of minutes ago, the only person charged in the Justice Department's investigation into the origins of the probe of former President Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and its ties to Russia was spared prison time for altering an email used to support a surveillance application. Specifically, Kevin Kleinsmith, an FBI attorney, received a sentence of 12 months probation and 400 hours community service from U.S. District Court Judge James Boasberg Friday during a video hearing. Kleinsmith is responsible for editing emails to deceptively portray Carter Page, who was a CIA asset, as instead having been a Russian asset. This is part of an attempt to bully the Trump presidency. I don't know, that's one word to use. To make them look very bad and to build up the case for Russiagate. Another dead end they were trying to tie up into some neat narrative here. But again, Kevin Kleinsmith, the only dude charged by John Durham as part of his probe into the origins of Russiagate, of the Mueller probe. And he gets off with a very, very, no jail time. I'll call that light.
And keep in mind, he was trying to keep that case going. Like, the point of him doing that was to keep the warrant on Page. Like, that was the entire point. So, this case is horrendous that it turned out this way. But I'm sorry.
It's not good.
I just wanted to point that out. that they were getting FISA warrants over him over and over and over again. In order to justify one of the warrants, that's what they did. They changed the thing, changed the email. So yeah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Today, Myanmar's military-run television network reported that the military had taken control of the country after declaring a state of emergency for an entire year. This amid reports that many of the country's senior politicians had been detained. That includes Aung San Suu Kyi, the state councilor, as well as the president, both of whom were detained. Instead, the military's chief was put in charge. This is a coup. This is a putsch. The takeover was quickly condemned as a coup by the European Union and human rights groups, and the newly sworn-in administration of President Joe Biden in Washington expressed grave concern. Not only did they express grave concern, they said, quote, they will, quote, take action against those responsible if these steps are not reversed, end quote. Now, I wonder what action they're going to take. The thing is, they've already sanctioned, under the global Magnitsky sanctions process, they've already sanctioned the guy who was put in charge here, the head of military. So they've done their sort of standard line here. They've done their standard operation already, which leaves me wondering, what comes next? What else are they going to do? Is that an idle threat? And if not, what's on the other side? Now, having said that, this isn't a good thing for Myanmar, to be clear. A presenter on Myanmar's military-owned Myawaddy TV announced the takeover and cited a section of the military-drafted constitution that allows the military to take control in times of national emergency. He said the takeover was in part due to the government's failure to act on the military's claims of voter fraud in last November's election and its failure to postpone the election because of the coronavirus crisis. One more quick headline before we close. In Russia, thousands were detained and then shortly after released this weekend as police responded to a wave of protests in dozens of cities across the country. Stimulated by the return of opposition figure Alexei Navalny, the protesters ranged in the tens of thousands from Siberia to St. Petersburg, driven by calls for unity in opposition to the presidency of Vladimir Putin and by charges of financial misconduct against Russian President Vladimir Putin. Those charges centered on a Black Sea state under construction that Navalny had alleged was owned by Putin in a popular YouTube documentary he and his team had published earlier on in January, just a couple of weeks ago. Russian businessman Arkady Rotenberg, by the way, has since claimed ownership of that property. So that, it's almost a 2-hour-long documentary on YouTube. But another businessman has since come out and claimed that is his property. He's the beneficiary of it. He's planning on turning it into a hotel. Anyway, those are headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we're going into a break. We'll be back in just a minute with Lucy Commissar talking about GameStop stocks, short selling, and taking your calls. Be right back on the other side of this break.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
So, Sean, what do you want to talk about today? Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Jamarl Thomas and myself, Shane Stranahan, and our guest, Lucy Commissar, investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption, who you can follow, by the way, on Twitter at Lucy Commissar. Also, please do check out her extensive reporting on financial corruption, her articles over at her website, thecommissarscoop.com. Lucy, thank you for joining us this morning. How are you doing?
I'm fine. My pleasure to be on the show again.
Our pleasure to have you. All right, we usually have you on. We're usually talking about Sergei Magnitsky, and specifically about Bill Browder, the Magnitsky Act, the financial background, going into a bunch of details there. That is, other than I think one or two exceptions, pretty much universally what we've had you on to talk about. This is one of those exceptions, and this is a big one. After last week, the stores of the shares, the stock for GameStop rose meteorically. I was going to say catastrophically, and that is true for the hedge funds who are shorting it. But this is driven by this Wall Street bets community. A lot of folks would have heard this. I'm sure a lot of folks were investing in GameStop too. You have a couple of different takes on this, and we're going to get into some of the details here of how naked short selling works, what the problems are, for how long we've known about them, because I was reading through the extensive documentation you sent over, your articles and your reporting as well as others. And this is a problem back in 2008, 2009. This has been a problem in the financial industry for a long time, and it continues to go unaddressed as apparently the Depository Trading Corporation, the company that's responsible for handling a significant minority of these short trades, effectively has undergone regulatory capture and is owned, by my account at least, but from my perspective, by the people it's supposed to be regulating, and is sort of, forsaken its duty to hold some degree of oversight on the entire process. Anyway, let's get into this on a high level. Lucy, how do you see the events of last week?
Okay, everything you have just said is correct. First, the number you have to look at, which has been reported, is that 130% of GameStop shares were in the market. Think of that. How could that's the float. The float is all the shares that have been issued. How could there be more than 100% of anything? How could there be 130%? That's the key number, because beyond 100%, those are phantom shares. They're not real shares. They're created by naked short selling. This is a corrupt system that is allowed by the SEC because it benefits the big hedge funds, and it is also allowed, in effect, by the Depository Trust and Clearing Corporation, which you refer to, the DTCC, which in fact is owned by its members, who are the major broker-dealers. It's the New York holding company charged with the clearance and settlement of securities. So, okay, you get the float. The float is the 100%, say it's 100 million shares issued by a company. Maybe the insiders and some other owners own 50 million of the shares. 50 million would be deposited in brokerage accounts. That is the broker that you go to, and those brokers are clients of the major broker dealers, which are the Goldman Sachs, the Citi, the Bank of America. They are the members of the DTCC.
And to be clear, Lucy, I just want to jump in for a second. Those two, just taking this sort of toy example as the scenario here, 50 million of it would be owned by the owners of the actual corporation or the company at hand, and then the other 50 million that you're talking about would be more or less publicly traded. It's the out of 100 million shares total, you have in this example about half that are in the hands of the people who own it, who have directive power, and the other half that are available for buying and selling on public exchanges.
Right. That's taking a possible number. It could be 90-10. It could be any number. But they're deposited in a brokerage account. So they're bought by hedge funds and by individuals. And they are settled at the DTCC. However, there's another, when the settlement, by the way, years ago, before everything was on computer, messengers would take around actual stock certificates, pieces of paper, which represented shares. And if you went to your broker and said, "I'm buying X," and they had to find a broker that was selling X for a client, and they would actually move the paper from one broker. Messengers on bicycles would move the paper. When they started doing a computer, no more paper. And they changed to everything being digital. And what people got were not paper. They got entitlements. People can still ask for paper if they want to, but most people do not. So they got entitlements. So the members of the brokers who were the prime brokers in the DTCC would have clients who were the broker that you went to or I went to. And if I bought something, my broker would find somebody selling it, and then the exchange would go to the prime broker and be registered. And they would move the digital entitlement in the prime broker's account at the DTCC from one prime broker to another. Now, why is it that there can be 130% of shares out there? Doesn't the DTCC know that it should be only 100%, only what's available? Well, there were two things that happened. One is, at the time when there was paper, people had to have a chance to do the settlement because somebody would make an order. They would send somebody on the bike with the paper. It took some time, and there was a lot of writing down instructions and a lot of bookkeeping. So the settlement had to be T+3. That's trade +3. If I bought something, it had to go into my account of my broker within 3 days, 3 trading days. More recently, they changed it to 2. Except, why is it even necessary when it's all digital, it's all computerized? That relates to naked short selling and to short selling. They're facilitating short selling. That means you sell a share you don't own. You sell it into the market, you promise to pay in 2 days. Means, and also, you have to either borrow it, your broker has to borrow it from someone who has it, or at least locate where it is if it's available. Now, people that have accounts in with brokers sign something which says you can sell my share, loan my shares. They probably don't even know that, but it's part of their agreement. Maybe it's in the small print. When the broker lends the shares, it gets interest, which goes to the broker because it hasn't even told you it's lent it. But sometimes they don't really lend the shares. Or if it's a locate, you say, your broker says, I know where I can get the share so that I will have it when it's T+2 time to actually transfer it to the buyer. Well, maybe 10 brokers can locate the same share. How can that be?
This comes with the multiplication of shares that you were talking about, the phantom shares that you were talking about earlier, and the question of how can you have more shares? How can you have 130% of these shares of a company like GameStop at hand?
And the person or the hedge fund with the phantom share is allowed to sell it, is allowed to lend it, is allowed to use it for collateral. This phantom share can be used in many, many ways. So you're getting more shares in the market. Another way this happens is that through something called X clearing. X means outside in this case, not clearing through the DTCC, through the prime brokers where the entitlement is moved digitally from one broker to another. These brokers, there may be, a dozen or less of them. There are not that many. And they have so many clients, both their clients are the regular brokers, and their regular brokers have so many clients that sometimes they just clear inside. Either inside, maybe one part of Goldman has clients, Goldman has client A and client B, and just sends from A to B. Or maybe it doesn't really send. Maybe it just tells it has sent and nobody knows because nobody can see what's going on. Or maybe two companies, maybe Citi and Bank of America are dealing one with the other because they know each other, and a seller in one company and one brokerage is selling to another, a buyer of another. Well, this makes it easier to do naked short selling, meaning they don't really T+2, they don't send the shares and nobody knows. And one reason that this became clear, it was maybe a dozen or more years ago, there was, and this has happened a lot, when you get to file your votes, you get to vote every year or so at proxy meetings, or you don't have to go, most people don't go to them, they just mail it in. Well, before the 2008 crash, there was a proxy meeting. Bank of America counted 130% of its shares voted. They received 30% more votes than they had shares outstanding. And that's just the people who voted, because everybody doesn't vote. Imagine how many shares were sold beyond what they actually authorized and issues. Now, this violates the rights of the shareholders. and it reduces.
It does, and it increases market volatility too, as far as I can tell, because what it basically cedes is power over corporations to these large players, the prime brokers and the hedge funds who are doing the mass of the multiplication of these shares. It gives them power to basically make or break a company's value. They can
two ways.
by having
there are two ways. One is in the voting. Remember there was the issue of the merger of Compaq and Hewlett Packard, and that would come up in a proxy vote. And suppose there are all these extra shares around, and that your broker dealer is JP Morgan, who was one of the advisors on the merger deal, and they were going to get more in fees if the merger went through than if it was voted down. Now, do you think they would be so careful about your vote? They're in control of the votes. At a certain point, after the 30% extra that Bank of America counted, the SEC said you can only accept as many shares as there really are out there. Well, suppose your broker is connected to one of the big prime brokers, and it has X number of clients who think that they have shares of Hewlett Packard, but they know they don't have real shares because they never got the delivery on the real shares. They were sold, but they were shorted, and they were never covered, and therefore they're only allowed to send in the shares, the votes for as many shares as they have real. Who tells them which ones to pick? You don't even know, if you're a client, that you didn't get a share, that yours is a phantom share. You have an entitlement, and you're allowed to sell your entitlement, but you don't know it's only an entitlement, that it's not real. So do you think that the company is going to be careful about, we'll just send in a percentage of all the votes and we'll just pick them out of a hat and we don't really care how they voted on this deal? No, I don't think so. I think they're going to pick the ones that vote the way the merger goes, because we're going to make money on that. So you're right.
Okay, Lucy, we've got to go into a break. We're out of time. I want to briefly highlight, and we're taking calls on the other side of this break, 202-521-1320. We're going to be talking about the app Robinhood, what their actual business model is. We've got a lot more to talk about here, but two quick notes on this. One is, why should you care? Why should the average person care about this? This is all sort of, it's somewhat removed from your daily concerns. You probably have never executed a naked short sale or a short sale at all. You probably, a lot of folks don't own stocks. They might just be getting into that with this whole media phenomenon that's been going on this last week. Two quick reasons why you'd care. For one thing, this is another sign that the real power brokers at hand actually have their hands on the levers when it comes to determining the value of a stock. So in other words, if you decide to get involved in the market, you can't trust what the media is saying on this stuff. They could at any moment, the people who have the most financial interest at stake could pull that power away from you. And we'll come back to this, knowing what you're going to do about the stock market through your purchases of these stocks, through Robinhood as well as these other apps. They can pull that away from you and do exactly the opposite of what you'd want them to. And then two is, say you have a pension, say you've worked for an organization for a long time, say you have some degree of investments yourself, but say for a moment you have a pension. That pension's value can in many cases be undermined. It can be stripped by the actions of exactly what we're talking about, by these massive naked short sells, which have consolidated power, financial power in the hands of a few, and often use that to the detriment of the many. But we have to go into a break, taking calls on the other side, joined by Lucy Commissar. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news. Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host, Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. Joining us is Lucy Commissar, investigative journalist focused on corporate and financial corruption. Lucy, again, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. I want to give you a very interesting quote to start off this part.
Well, wait, Lucy. I wanted to ask you something, actually. Because I wanted to get into GameStop before we run out of time, and we didn't get the chance to hit it earlier. The GameStop thing is phenomenal. It's extraordinary, and it's one of those things where, just based on even your explanation in the last segment, that if this wasn't a crime, Lord knows it should be. And I'm talking about from the standpoint of the way it was manipulated after the fact against the small-time lenders who was in this program. For example, let's play a clip for the moment. This is Robinhood's CEO. Let's listen to him and listen to what he says that the point of Robinhood is. This is hilarious. Play the clip, please.
I want you to address the obvious. This looks like a move by an outfit called Robinhood, which is supposed to be taken from the rich and given to the poor, and doing exactly the opposite. That when the big guys, including one of your main investors in your company, started to lose, you shut down the game to starve the little guy. Fair criticism.
That's not what it is at all. And I know you started this segment. It really resonated with me because you described the story of Robinhood. Robinhood started 5 years ago by pioneering commission-free, no-account minimum mobile investing. And we've been the spokesperson of the individual investor, and our whole goal as an institution is to enable those customers, empower them, and give them access to the markets, because for the longest time, markets have been only accessible to the wealthy. And so the entire industry adopted our business model in 2019. And in 2020, we added millions of new customers. The entire industry added millions of new customers who took advantage of the market rally and became investors for the very first time. So, we had to make a very difficult decision to protect our customers and our firm.
Now, Lucy, the point of Robinhood wasn't to steal from the rich and give to the poor. I mean, it was basically the opposite, where they were handing over data on customer purchases. Also, this idea of Robinhood is a little Orwellian, right? I mean, based on payment flow, based on the way they make their money on this, and the way that you described in the first period, basically fraud. I mean, at the end of the day, like you say, they may not even have the shares. Like, that seems mind-blowing to me that will be legal. And oddly enough, all of the people on CNBC and whatnot that don't typically want legislation, all of a sudden are calling for legislation. Now, what is the reality of this?
What you just indicated, if you're not a customer because you're paying, and those people that had Robinhood apps, you're the product. They were selling user trader data to the hedge funds so they could use it to manipulate trade and markets. But it got too big, it got out of hand. And there was a lot of trading done by dark pools. These are secret funds owned by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, UBS, and they have made many thousands, made perhaps millions. We don't know because that's why it's a dark pool. And they have been trading in this stock. So that was the reason for it, but it just got out of hand. And one of the reasons that they may have had to stop is that they had to put in margin for some of the trades that they were in charge of, and they weren't getting any money. And that's part of the whole system. Supposedly, what I have read is JP Morgan could have made millions on this. And so it's what the possibility is that Robinhood was to help the big guys trade against the dumb money. But that wasn't the purpose of it. The purpose was to help the big guys manipulate trades, and it just went off. But the fascinating thing I wanted to, because you're giving me that one quote, I want to give you one other really interesting quote. Bernie Madoff wrote from prison in 2012, quote, "It was perfectly proper to short my client's securities or purchase those positions back from the clients or others with any profit or loss recorded on my books. The point is, this was prior to the time I fell into my crime of staying naked short. He means not covering. The fact that the prosecutor and trustee seem clueless of this is why my frustration is so great. And he said most of my professional clients were well aware of how I traded. So naked shorting is not a secret, and it was one of the big problems that Bernie Madoff had. And still, when you see or hear people talking about this now, they're talking about shorting. They're not talking about naked shorting. The problem of the T+2, giving you 2 days to cover your trade when you no longer need to send some boys on bikes with pieces of paper representing the stock certificate, that is to allow this shorting, which allows naked shorting. And everybody knows how this works. And the question is, if there is legislation discussed or there is a problem discussed in Congress, are they going to deal with naked shorting and discuss the need to change T+2 into immediate transfer? There's no reason not to have an immediate transfer.
Because just to be clear, that's destabilizing to the market. I mean, basically that short selling number could have went up. They say infinity, but practically it could have kept going up, meaning they lost billions. And if this is one of those things that takes place, it seems like it's a systemic flaw. How is this legal? How is the payment flow thing, not payment flow, but how is this very specifically legal? Because you make an extremely good point. If they don't have the stock, how on earth are they selling the stock? And it seems like they're making money out of thin air. Like basically, I don't have the stock, but I'm still going to make money off of it either way. That seems so criminal. Right.
Because the SEC is controlled by the big broker dealers. I mean, it's called regulatory capture. You know, the reason for the stock market crash, a major part of the stock market crash in 1929 was the practice of watering the stock. Watering the stock meant creating out of thin air more stock than had ever been issued and selling it. That's what there was a famous line. That somebody, a doggerel, somebody said, "He who sells what isn't his'n must make it good or go to prison." Well, that's exactly what is happening now, and the SEC allows it because when you buy stock, you think you bought the stock, and you send money from your account with your broker is transferred to the payment part, and the broker has control over it, who then sends it to the prime broker. Well, they don't they don't transfer it to the seller yet until they actually receive the share, but they can use it. Do you know what it means to have the use for free of millions of dollars? That's why they do it. And there is something the SEC calls a buy-in. That is, if you don't receive the share on behalf of your client, you can buy it in the market and send the bill to the broker that was supposed to send you the share. But since both sides are doing it, they don't buy in. There was actually a paper that was done for the SEC some years ago about buy-ins, which said they don't buy in. They each agree not to buy in the other because each side is making so much money that that their clients, not knowing they never got a real share, have put in their accounts so that the client no longer can use the money. The broker and the prime broker, they can use the money. That's why this goes on. That's one of the ways they make money off it.
Okay, Lucy, we've only got a couple of minutes left. I'm going to try to hit the question that a lot of people are thinking about on this one. Who should go to jail over this? And another side of this, what can be done to prevent this from happening in the future? What laws should be changed? How should these, which institutions deserve to be scrutinized? What do we do about it, Lucy?
The problem is jail is when there's a criminal offense. All of the regulations are civil. Rules that the SEC writes are civil, and they have fined some of these. Goldman Sachs had a system where they will allow its hedge fund clients to make its own trades from computers where the short sales were labeled as long sales, and they got fined some millions of dollars. That's it. But that's the cost of doing business. Unless you make it a criminal offense, which it is not a criminal offense, to sell something well, first, to not cover. The rule says you have to cover in 2 days. It should be a criminal offense if you don't cover. Now, of course, I think that they shouldn't allow the short selling to begin with, and they should have immediate coverage, and they can do this because of computers. But they don't want to do that because it's part of the system that they can game to have short selling. And one of the things, by the way, it also does is it brings down companies, because if there's a big short attack, that means there are more stocks in the market than really exist. Therefore, the price goes down. If there is more of something, the price goes down. And so that's why they have used this to attack and to kill some companies, very often some small companies that can't fight back. So these kinds of things should be banned. The SEC knows all about this. There has been a lot of testimony about this. There has been some written about this, not usually the guys that work, or the women who work for the big papers and are beholden to the big companies. They think short selling is really great because it keeps some of the bad companies on their toes. That's not how it's used. It's used to game the system, and it's used to hurt the general person who buys stocks wants the stock to go up. The short selling and naked short selling, the focus is how do we make this stock go down, and that is not in the interest of the people who individually or through their pension funds have stocks. So those things have to change. There's been plenty written about this. The SEC knows about it. The question is whether the people put on the SEC by Biden are going to continue with what was really a scam. I mean, I think of it as embezzlement. When they're taking money on false pretenses, these big brokers, prime brokers, I think it's like embezzlement. They're taking money that comes from investors. But
that's why, Lucy, we've got to close this out. That's why there should be criminal penalties. I don't know how else to say it. This is, for all the talk about too big to fail, this is way too big to succeed. It's not good for the financial system. And like you're saying, it's not good for the quote unquote dumb money. It's not good for individual people buying and selling stocks. It de-democratizes that process. It's shocking that Robinhood was involved. And in the long run, I can't help but feel that there should be criminal penalties for this. But we've got to close this segment out. Great overview. Thank you, Lucy Commissar, for joining us. For those listening, Lucy is an investigative journalist focusing on corporate and financial corruption. You can follow her on Twitter at Lucy Commissar and read her articles at thecommissarscoop.com. We'll be back in a minute taking calls, 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be right back.
Fault Lines. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
And we are back, and we are taking your calls. The phone number is 202-521-1320. Again, that's 202-521-1320. You're listening to Fault Lines. We've got Brave calling in from Atlanta. Brave, you're on the line. What's going on?
Hey, good morning, guys. Real quick, in response to the session with Nefa, I enjoy that brother's work, but I really find it frustrating when Pan-Africans or anyone that takes the time out to slander ADOS, the ADOS movement, or even the concept of ADOS, knowing very well that it's not about a conservative value or discriminating between different groups of Black people. I should to point out real quick, there was a New York Times article written by Farrah Stockman. It points to the disparities between Black people who immigrated to the United States voluntarily versus those whose ancestors were brought here in chains. A 2007 study published in the American Journal of Education found that 41% of Black freshman Ivy League colleges were immigrants or the children of immigrants, even though those groups represent 13% of the Black population in the United States. Say very quickly, the idea is not to separate ourselves from other blacks and other from other countries. The idea is to outline a very specific need based on a very specific circumstance, which is slavery in America. So when we say American descendants of slavery, it is not to say that there's no respect for the fight and the plight for black people around the world. No, that there is solidarity there. You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
It's just simply to point out that the experiences are different. Much like you say, take a Kamala Harris or a Barack Obama, whose experiences are not the ADOS experience. They're likely, and it's not to say that, they're not black. It's to say that their experience growing up, the things that were available to them, come on the back of blacks who have died and survived slavery, who fought through the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, who fought through redlining, who fought through all of these things that not only set American descendants of slavery back, but literally stepped on and buried them. So it's more the point of making a legal argument by tying it to lineage. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because and I'll close it very quickly by saying this: if reparations are passed, reparations should not be passed and then given to every single person with brown skin, if it's based on slavery and the things that came from American slavery. You see what I'm saying? Because we're not going to get reparations from reparations given to people in South Africa. You see what I'm saying? Yeah. But they should get theirs. That's a simple point.
I agree with you on this, Braith. The reason why I kept going there with NETFA, because I felt like there was an interesting conversation there, especially with the distinction between Pan-Africanism and the American descendants of slaves. For some reason in my head, I keep wanting to say African. I have to keep correcting myself. But in the very specific case, you're right. There was a demarcation point. You know what I mean? Like at slavery, there was a demarcation point. And the experience of Africans or African Americans in this country was different. And like you said, for the reparations argument, it seems grossly unfair for something like that to be able to go to basically people who are not or who did not encounter this particular American experience. And by the way, if you want to look at affirmative action, the main purveyor of that was white women. Think about that. That was supposed to be one of those things for slavery. So, Brave, I totally agree with you, man. Yeah, good point. What do you think, Shane?
So here I get the argument. I'll put it like this. Brave, early on in your call, and I don't mean to talk about you because we got to move to other calls. I don't mean to respond to you and then give you no chance to respond, but I've got to do so, and I'm not going to be too critical here because I'm not, frankly. You said it's not about discriminating between black people. It's not about creating sort of discriminatory lines. There are two definitions of the word discrimination that, of course, are useful here. One, it would be more like discriminating against, which is a sort of derogatory drawing of boundaries, whatever. The other is technically, yes, this is absolutely discrimination. It is discriminating between two groups of people. That's the entire point of it, is to draw a line. And I'm not saying that you said the opposite of that. I get where you're going, which is there's no like pejorative nature for this. It's not trying to divide people. But what makes it divisive, of course, is the fact that it is technically trying to divide between different groups of people. It's the whole point of it. And again, I'm not saying that as somebody who's critical of it. It's just that is literally the usefulness, like you're saying, particularly if you're pushing for reparations. I agree. You would want that to be going to the people who are actually victims of the crimes that were committed. The reparations are supposed to repair. So I'm on board with you there. I'm just saying it is technically,
by definition,
it's discriminating between groups.
By definition,
it's doing
that. Yeah. No, totally. I understand that. I understand that. You basically make the point like, look, you have to have some level of discrimination. Otherwise, you can't make the separation. You're just everybody is everybody. No, the fair point, Shane. Stedman from Detroit. Stedman, what's going on?
Hey, so I'm kind of just going to piggyback off Brave a bit. Essentially with the ADOS movement, some people call it ADOF or descendants of chattel slavery in the United States, and Pan-Africanism, the issue really shouldn't be an issue. I've said that before. It shouldn't necessarily be an issue, but I feel like what Pan-Africanism does is it waters down the uniqueness of individual people and individual groups in a specific way that they would like these groups to interact with the world, right? So, like one of the things about Jamarl, you always talk about how you had have Native American ancestry. My wife's mother is white. I have my ancestry is not 100% African. And so, I mean, in my opinion, that is what makes us all in this country Black. Not that we all have necessarily Native American ancestry or white ancestry, but it's the unique
experience. It's a unique
Native
experience.
American and European in this country, and the 400-year separation between all of us that does make us a unique group of people. And so, like, when you look at Pan-Africanism, it reinforces this idea of race in that you're Black, so you must be an African. Or, you know, that because your ancestors come from this place 400 years ago, that you're still attached to that culture, even though I have no knowledge of that culture, the languages, even the region, because even if we weren't mixed with different quote unquote racial groups, we would still be mixed with different African tribes. So there's not even a single tribe in Africa that I could link my lineage back to. And so what this really does is it minimizes the life struggle of people in this country, Black people in this country, in an attempt to create a utopian dream of unity that doesn't exist. Every major Pan-African country or movement or leader has been murdered, or the country no longer participates. I mean, it reached its height in the 60s. Okay, 50 years later, 60 years later, we haven't been able to come up with a different way to regroup. And so, like what Ray was talking about, when you look at, for example, the color of wealth in LA by the Federal Reserve of San Francisco, it breaks down the wealth in LA among racial groups. And you can look and see how in LA, non-native Blacks, immigrant Blacks, have more wealth and have more income or assets than native Black Americans. And so to look at it like we've been here for 400 years and have had to struggle in ways that, like James Baldwin talked about with John F. Kennedy or Bobby Kennedy saying in 4 years, if you're a good person, maybe you can be president. Well, my people built this country for free, and yours came over here at best 50, 60 years ago. You know what I'm saying? Or 100 years ago. And so there's another book I've mentioned before by an associate professor at Howard named Michelle Niambi Carter called American While Black. And it discusses the role immigration has played on Black lives. Immigration as a tool of white supremacy to further disenfranchise Black people. And so it's not about denigrating immigration, but it's about looking in the mirror and recognizing that while individual immigrants may not be your enemy, the system of immigration has been used from the inception of this country to disenfranchise the native Black population while they were enslaved, especially after they had been freed. I mean, you look at the draft riots that happened in New York, you look at a lot of different racial uprisings. Even Frederick Douglass, he went to Ireland. He saw, you know, how the Irish were being treated by the English. And he tried to build an allegiance with them. But when the Irish got to America, they had no interest in aligning with the Black Americans. They wanted to align with the majority whites who they understood had power and control. So we have to see that immigration has a negative impact on our lives. And if we can understand that and try to work within that space to correct the situation, everybody can be free and everybody can express themselves around the world. We can fight for
Stedman. Thank you for the call. We got Stedman. Thank you for the call. We got two other callers. I do appreciate it, but I want to make sure we have time for the others. We got Michael calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah, hi. Look, those two calls were great. And I'd also like to say it's not just America who should be paying reparations. There's also the English who took them over there and the Dutch and all the rest of the Eastern Europeans who went around colonizing the world, very Western Europeans who went around colonizing the world and enslaving people, and also committing genocides in South America and North America, and as well as Australia and other countries around the world. They're the people who should be paying, you know, and Hitler was a rank amateur compared to these people. You know, these Western Europeans, they're still doing it today, the American governments and all these Western governments, they're still slaughtering people and committing genocides around the world. They make Hitler look like a rank amateur, to be honest. And in terms of like what the lady was talking about by financial crimes, I think it was Goldman Sachs. They actually laundered like $10 billion in drug cartel money. They funded terrorists. And that was HSBC. I mean, banks launder money for drug runners, and they know they're doing it for drug cartels. They finance terrorists. There's a lot of charges they should be in jail on, to be honest.
Yes, agreed, 100%. Hong Kong Shanghai Banking Corporation, HSBC. We've talked about them a lot before in the context of Browder, but you're right. A lot more dirty stuff going on there. Michael, thank you for the call. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
How y'all doing? Good morning. I agree with Brave. But anyway, as y'all can see, the reason why we need WikiLeaks, the reason why we need Julian Assange to be free, Klein Smith got a slap on his wrist. Okay? WikiLeaks is doing the job of the American press, the Western press, right? They're actually doing investigative journalism and exposing crimes of different nations, especially in the U.S.
And that's why they get punished. Go for it. You got about 30 seconds here, Tarif.
Yeah, that's why he's still in prison, because the British government, the MI6 and CIA and Mossad and whatnot is tied all together. So he needs to be freed. Hashtag Julian Assange. Hashtag drop the charges. They had a petition going around saying that get nominated, and I signed and I donated money and all that. So people, we got to push for the freeing of Julian Assange. If not, democracy die in darkness. We got to push for his freedom, because he's a real journalist. Everybody else is afraid.
Tarif, can't help but think you're right. We got to close today's show out, but thank you for the call, Tarif. Thank you to our guests. Thank you to our callers. Thank you to our producers. Thank you to our audio engineer, Andre. And thank you, Jamarl Thomas, for co-hosting the show with me. And thank you, that is you most of all, for listening. We'll be back tomorrow, folks. Signing off, Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back later.
All right. Fault Lines, another one in the record books. Thank you guys for joining us. Interesting interviews. You know, it's funny. I'm beginning to think that the topic for the initial segment might have been an interesting thing for the ADOS conversation. And because it's very strange. Like, I hear people make this argument about ADOS being anti-immigration, and that's not what I get. It feels like there's a line that's been created that didn't necessarily need to be created between those things. And one can respect and recognize that slavery on some level was a demarcation point, and that the responsibilities, or let's say the issues and the things that African Americans in the country, meaning the things that plague them, are specific to them in some way. I understand that each country has their own issues and everything else, but there is inherently somewhat of a different experience from having a legacy that goes all the way back, slavery, to now. And so this puts me in mind of the James Baldwin Malcolm X argument, where these guys get into a back and forth over, I guess you can say, Americanism. Like, James Baldwin, I think, was more right in his argument, basically saying, if I got on a boat right now and went back to Africa, I am still an American. My thoughts, the way I relate to the world, blue crabs during the summer, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Those are things that you identify with just because that's your touchstones. Driving up and down Monument Avenue, yes, Confederate statues, no, didn't see it that way for years. Driving up and down, it's just part of what you're used to. And so I do think there's a distinction there that should be honored. And yeah, if it was something like reparations and everything else, I entirely understand this notion of not everybody was subjected to this, hence not everybody should be part of this. No, I totally get that. I would make one additional case for that, though, and say that in addition to something like that, you would also need healthcare, medical, education, all that stuff also. My concern is that pushing for something like that, even if you were able to get it, it will create a backlash where, let's say, poor whites will take severe issue with it. Now, that in and of itself can't be enough or be all and a reason why you wouldn't necessarily push for it. It is something, however, to just be overtly aware of, that it will create strife unless your economy and your society is somewhat stable. It's one thing if people had the things that they needed and you were balancing the equation. Fair enough. You'll get flack, but the flack is not going to be overly significant. It's another thing if it's deep poverty by some of the elements of the society, and one element is given money that they're owed. The fact that the money is owed is not necessarily going to register. And a lot of people are going to be attacking it for that very specific reason under the idea that it's owed. Yeah, reparations should be something we push for. In fact, it should have been something we were pushing for during the Black Lives Matter protests. I think we would have gotten more bang for our buck, especially not allowing Democrats to to shimmy out of this stuff of doing anything real and significant on the issue of crime and policing. Instead, giving these kind of, oh yeah, we're going to do this for crime and policing, when the real actual nub of it, the thing that actually gets to the core of it, is the economics of it. If you're looking at the locations where many of these protests and riots were taking place, the areas were dirt poor in many respects, especially when you're looking at where African Americans were in the context of those societies when that stuff blew up. People always like to point afterwards, never caring while it's taking place in general. But look, I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like, I'm going to say share, I'm going to say make sure you hit the subscription button. And I'll be back in a few. Thanks all.